Every person upon this earth is defined by their past events. We are ultimately a culmination of our experiences and our reactions to them. My most defining event happened 2 years ago, when my home burned to the ground. I was 19, living at home with my parents and little sister when it happened. I would find out after the fact that there had been some kind of electrical issue in the walls, which is why no one noticed the fire until it was already out of hand. I had been the only one awake when I first noticed smoke pouring from underneath my door. I was laying on my bed, barely conscious, and scrolling YouTube when I noticed a weird smell. When I finally looked up, it was like the fires of hell were raging just beyond the threshold of my room. I jumped up and began screaming, throwing the door open to get my parents. I stepped into the hallway, choking on the acrid haze that filled my lungs and stung my eyes. I made my way to my parents' bedroom by memory, more than by sight, the smoke obscuring everything. I threw the door open and screamed the word, "Fire!" repeatedly. I must have yelled it 5 or 6 times before I heard them scrambling towards the door. "Where's Erin?" It was my mother's voice, quaking with barely controlled panic. "I'll get her. Just go with Dad," I yelled back, spinning around and making my way to my little sister's room. My mother was injured before I was born and couldn't walk without the assistance of a wheelchair. Otherwise, I doubt she would have left without Erin. My father, on the other hand, was the polar opposite. I couldn't see it at the time because my eyes were still stinging from the smoke, but I would later find out that he lifted her over his shoulder and sprinted towards the front door. It had been a strategic decision, as I wouldn't be able to carry my mom effectively enough to get her out. Otherwise, my father would have gone for my sister first. I felt proud, even in that horrifying moment, that he would trust me with the life of his daughter. I made my way to Erin's room, the smoke getting worse by the second. I was completely blind by the time I felt the doorknob in my hand, reduced to tactile sensation to find my way at this point. I flung it open and called out to Erin, hearing her call my name back. "Harry, help!" came the tiny voice of a 6-year-old answering me. I held my arms open and felt the sudden impact of her thumping against me and throwing her arms around my neck. "Don't worry, Rin, just don't open your eyes, okay?" I felt her bury her face into my shoulder as I stood up, holding her as close to me as possible. The smoke must have been getting worse because I was unable to breathe at this point. I began to worry about passing out and knew I would have to move fast to get out. I made my way through the hallway, smacking into the walls and coughing uncontrollably, each attempted breath making me gag. Still, I found the stairs and began descending as rapidly as I could, while being completely blind. With each step, it became hotter, until I could feel the flames lapping at my skin. Still, I knew any hesitation would mean a horrible death for both me and my sister. I pulled off my shirt, wrapping it around my sister and yelling for her to keep her eyes shut, that we were almost out. I would have taken a deep breath, but all the air was gone, being devoured by the hungry fire that raged around us. Instead, I skipped the breath and just ran, feeling dizzier by the second. What came next was the most intense pain I have ever felt in my life. I ran with one arm wrapped tight around Erin's small form and the other stretched out in front of me, feeling for the front door. As I ran, I felt my skin burning and heard a sizzling sound all around my head. In the back of my mind, I registered that I was hearing my hair catching fire. As I pushed through the pain and heat, I felt all my hope evaporate as my hand collided with the wall. I couldn't find the door. That's when the panic set in. I was screaming in agony, my exposed back being scorched and my nose catching the scent of something like burned hair and cooking pork. Yet, even with my entire world being turned to pain and darkness, I pressed on, desperately smacking the wall until I felt my hand push through into the cool night air. My screams of terror and pain were intermingled with a scream of triumph as I ran onto the front lawn, falling into the grass with Erin still in my arms. I vaguely heard my mother sobbing and my dad speaking. "You're gonna be okay, Harry. Everything going to be okay." "Is she all right? Is she all right?" I heard my own voice croaking in response. In response, Aaron didn't speak, just squeezed my neck harder. Even with the pain it caused me, I felt immediate relief flood through me. I lay back and loosened my grip, feeling my cracked and burned lips split as I smiled involuntarily. As I heard the sirens getting closer, I finally let myself slip into the blissful and painless void of nothingness that I had been staving off the whole time. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. My whole body was aching and my parents were sitting next to my bed. When my eyes opened, I heard my mother gasp. "How's Aaron?" was the first thing I asked, my voice cracking a little as she said my name. "She's fine. Everyone's fine, Harry," she answered, her voice cracking a little as she said my name. "She's been with Aunt Jen and Uncle Zach since the fire. She's just fine. Didn't have a mark on her," my father added. That was the good news. They broke the bad news to me after. I had been in a medically induced coma for 3 days. I didn't realize how bad it all was until I asked to see a mirror and they refused. That's when I got worried. Those next few weeks were hard, not just because of my own disfigurement, but seeing the pain my father and mother wore on their faces every time I looked at them. They stayed there with me, one leaving occasionally to go change clothes or eat, but coming right back to stay with me. They were there as I healed. They were there as I went through the skin grafts. They were there when I was finally discharged. My life changed pretty drastically after that. People never looked at me the same. I had been a pretty good-looking guy before the fire, but after, well, I don't have to describe what a burn victim looks like if you've ever seen one. Still, I kept my spirits up by any means necessary. Besides, anytime the depression started to get to me, I would just look at Aaron and feel nothing but gratitude that we had both survived. I had become something of a hero for a while. I was interviewed by local news affiliates, and people sent all kinds of gifts. People always say they admire the way I stay positive, but it really isn't hard. I could be dead. Aaron could have died. My parents could have died. It's hard to feel anything but gratitude when you consider that reality. Over the next 2 years, life didn't return to normal, but it did find a new equilibrium. I became used to the face that looked back at me in the mirror and was no longer shocked by it. I got used to the looks people gave me, the whispers I'd hear around me when I was in public. I got used to telling my story when people inevitably got comfortable enough to ask what happened to me. I learned to accept all of it, but I still missed the way I used to look. My old face was like a distant memory, dancing at the edges of my mind. I did my best to forget about it and move on, but still thought about it all the time, like I was recalling a faint and pleasant dream. I never quite fully let go of that dream either. So when I heard about an experimental treatment to restore the damage the fire caused, I didn't think twice. I leapt at the opportunity. I met with Dr. Cephalo at a large facility 2 hours from where I lived. It had been a long drive, but it had passed quickly as I jabbered on about how amazing it would be if I could return to my old life. My father seemed hesitant to give in to the hope I was already swept away by, but I could tell he was excited too. We pulled into a parking garage and made our way through a large lobby area. The entire room was a sterile white and filled with the overpowering smell of disinfectants that lingered in all medical centers. That smell seemed to pull the memories of my hospitalization from my mind, but I pushed them back down. Not even the trauma of what I had been through could diminish the excitement I felt in my chest. The lady at the front desk checked us in and let us know where to find Dr. Cephalo's office on the 3rd floor of the building. Before long, we were standing outside a plain metal and glass door with the words Research and Development, Dr. Cephalo, printed in simple white letters across the middle. A middle-aged man with gray hair wearing a white coat opened the door before we could knock and reached out to shake my hand. "You must be Harrison," he exclaimed. "It's a pleasure to meet you, son. Please, come in." He led us into a modest office and gestured for us to sit across from the desk dominating the room. As we sat down, he pulled out a binder and slid it across the desk to me. The cover had 2 words printed on it: Stero Idea Program. I know I touched on the program in the email I sent to you, but I figured you'd want some more information and put this together for you," said Dr. Cephalo in an excited voice. I flipped it open and saw there was a picture of starfish on the first page. The second page showed two images, one where the starfish was missing a limb, and the second showing it partially grown back. I won't beat around the bush. This program is a revolutionary new way to regrow skin. You see, we have the same genes that starfish use to regrow limbs. They just lie dormant. My program partially activates those genes to induce the regrowth of certain tissues that are severely damaged or even missing entirely. "Oh, I'll grow new skin?" I asked in disbelief. "Absolutely. In fact, we're currently trying to induce the growth of new limbs in amputees. We're a far way from that currently, but we have been able to achieve skin regrowth without scarring in rats," he said, his eyes shining with wonder. "That's incredible," my father almost shouted next to me, making me jump but doing nothing to remove the smile from my face. "Well, I thought the first human subject to undergo the treatment should be equally incredible," he responded with a wink in my direction. "I'm sold. When can we start?" I chimed in. "Right away, actually," answered the doctor, reaching into the desk drawer and pulling out a syringe. "It's a simple injection, but the important part is recording the results. I'd need you to record a video of yourself every morning when you wake up and send it to me. We need to meticulously track every part of the process to make sure we can take it to market. Can you do that, Harry?" I nodded my head furiously, eliciting a chuckle from the doctor and my father as I stuck my arm and gestured for him to inject me with the needle. "Okay, Harry, you ready to be a hero for a second time?" the doctor asked, picking up the syringe. "As long as it doesn't hurt as bad as the first time," I laughed. The needle slid in with a small sting and the liquid was pushed into my vein, and for the first time since the fire, I didn't try to push away the memory of my old face. I embraced it. "That's it?" I asked. "That's it," the doctor said with a grin. He sent me home with the binder to keep, and I flipped through it some more on the way home. Looking back, maybe I should have read it before agreeing to an experimental medical treatment, but I know it wouldn't have mattered what was in there. It could have said anything, and all I would have heard is that I had the chance to not be disfigured anymore. Most of it was pretty boring, just specifications on which genes were being activated and instructions to triple my caloric intake to make sure my body had enough energy for the increased metabolic load of growing new tissue. The most interesting part were photos of rats that'd been skinned before the injection. Each new photo showed the progress by which they recovered. After about a week, they looked normal and were already growing new fur. I had a lot of trouble falling asleep that night, the excitement keeping me awake. When I finally did, I dreamed of looking in the mirror, seeing my old face staring back. The first couple of days, nothing happened. I woke up and recorded the videos for Dr. Cephalo, describing my increased appetite and the extra hour I was sleeping a night. On the third day, however, the itching started. It felt like my skin was covered in mosquito bites and took all I could to not scratch myself bloody. It only lasted 2 days, but it was awful. Then, on the 5th day, I could see the difference. My skin, which was once mottled and red, had regained a certain pinkness to it, looking a little like Erin had looked when she had first come home from the hospital. I stared at it for almost 20 minutes, completely amazed at what I was seeing. The video I recorded for Dr. Cephalo that day was a little difficult to make because I was crying the whole time. I watched it before I sent it to him, marveling at the tears of happiness rolling down my cheeks that looked more normal than they had in 2 years. By the 8th day, my skin looked more normal, having recovered its original color. I was amazed to see my hair beginning to grow again, too. I spent the entire day going to as many public places as possible, looking like a lunatic with the way I smiled at everyone. The problems didn't start until the 11th day. I woke up and felt itchy again, all over. My skin looked thicker, but I didn't think much of it. Still, I made sure to mention it in the video to Dr. Cephalo. 2 days later, it still itched and was becoming unbearable. I started becoming a little worried and called the doctor to ask him if I should be concerned. That's strange, but it could just be part of the process. The problem with injecting rats is that they can't tell us how they're feeling. So for all we know, this is completely normal. His words put me a little more at ease, but as the days wore on, it only got worse. One morning I woke up and was having trouble opening my eyes. It was like the lids were too big to fully lift, almost like my eyes were swelling shut. I looked in the mirror and saw that slits of my eyes were smaller than normal, like the skin was growing in around them. I was going to call Dr. Cephalo to tell him about the new development, but he called me first. "Harry, we need you to come to the facility. It's important." It was the first time I heard him sound worried, and I began to feel a deep uneasiness in the pit of my stomach. I tried to get him to tell me why, but he just insisted that I come up there as soon as possible. A few hours later, I was sitting in the same office across the same desk and could make out the doctor's worried face as he tried to find the words to tell me something. "Harry, we need you to stay here for a few days," he almost whispered, his voice full of guilt as he addressed me. "I don't understand. What's going on?" I asked. I felt the reassuring weight of my father's hand on my shoulder and realized a little panic had crept into my voice. "Harry, there's no easy way to say this, so I'll just come right out with it. The rats we first injected with this are showing some side effects of the gene activation." "What kind of side effects?" I asked. "Their skin hasn't stopped growing. We're working on a way to counter those effects, but for now you'll require surgical intervention to ensure more serious complications don't occur," he said, frustrating me with how cryptic he was being. "What do you mean their skin hasn't stopped growing? What kind of complications should I be worried about?" I stammered, fighting to keep calm. "Harry, the skin doesn't know where to stop. We have to surgically remove it to ensure it doesn't get out of hand." It took me a moment to understand what he was saying. When it finally registered, I felt a fresh wave of fear wash over me. "You need to cut off the extra skin," I muttered. "It's only temporary," he cut in quickly. "We're working non-stop on a way to deactivate the genes causing this. I promise you, we're going to fix this." After the initial shock had passed, I was led to a room. It was nicer than the one I stayed in after the fire. Clearly they wanted me to be as comfortable as possible since they didn't know how long I'd be staying there. My dad told me he, Mom, and Aaron would visit me every chance they got and not to worry too much. I did my best to look brave for him, but the excess skin around my face inhibited my ability to make normal facial expressions. That first night was hard for me. My skin felt like it was crawling over my body, as if the underside was full of spider legs crawling over my flesh and spreading it as it grew. The nurses gave me medications and creams to make it not so bad, but even then, I could still feel it. I had a nightmare that night that I was back in the fire. I couldn't breathe or see and was trying to scream. When I woke up, I found out why. My skin had grown over my eyes and was in the process of clogging my nose. My mouth could barely open as the edges had started to fuse together. That's when they had performed the first surgery, cutting holes around the openings of my face like they were making a cheap Halloween mask. They sedated me for it, and when I awoke, I could thankfully see and breathe again. I asked to see a mirror, and just like when I awoke after the fire, my request was denied. It became harder to speak after a couple days. The skin had consumed my lips, reducing my mouth to a fleshy slit that made every word sound wet and muddled. After a couple more days, I had to keep eye drops handy at all times. They had to remove my eyelids, so I could no longer blink. Every other day I would dream of blinding, choking smoke, and awake to find the skin had covered my face again. It was getting worse, and I found myself praying that Dr. Cephalo would find a solution soon. My parents came to visit me regularly. While I didn't have a mirror to see my face, I could gauge how bad it was getting by my mother's tears and my father's fearful expressions. "Don't worry, Harry. You survived the fire and you'll survive this too," my father said to me, placing a hand on my shoulder to reassure me like he had done since I was a small child. My skin had grown too thick to feel it anymore, but it still comforted me. One morning, I awoke in the middle of the night, unable to breathe at all. The skin had covered my mouth and nose. I tried to scream, but could only produce muffled noises emanating from my throat. The panic rose up in me as I knocked the table by my bed over, desperate to attract some kind of attention. Finally, in desperation, I sucked in the flap of skin that had replaced my mouth and bit down hard. It hurt almost as bad as the fire had, but fear pushed me past the limits of my pain threshold. I could hear myself trying to scream as I chewed a fresh hole where my mouth had once been. "Help me," I screamed out, spraying blood along with the words. I heard the nurses burst through the door and felt a needle stab into my arm. Not pushed, but stabbed. It was the only way to get through the thick layer of skin that surrounded my body now. The sedative worked quickly, and I soon awoke with fresh new holes cut in my face to breathe and see out of. When I woke up, I was looking at Dr. Cephalo sitting next to my bed with a look of such sadness on his face I thought I had died. "I'm so sorry, Harry. No one deserves this, least of all you," he said with tears brimming in his eyes. "Are you any closer to a cure?" I responded icily, the words coming out with the disgusting flap of excess flesh against my teeth. "You're a brave kid. You know that? We tried one serum and it looked like it would work for a while, but, well, it stopped all skin production. The rats that we injected shed their skin and quickly died. We're still working on it, but it doesn't seem like it will be as easy as just deactivating the genes." I didn't respond, just stared forward as the tears stung the open wounds around my eyes. "It's a race against time, Harry," he continued. "The process is speeding up, and there will come a point that we can't cut through your skin fast enough. I'm so sorry." "Doctor," I said, finally finding my voice, "can you please do one thing for me?" "Of course, son. Can you please bring me a mirror?" I whispered. He looked like he was about to say no, but got up instead and left the room. He came back a short moment later holding a hand mirror against his chest, his face full of guilt. "Are you sure?" he asked, sitting next to me. "Yes, I'm sure." The fear of wondering how bad it is might be worse than the reality. "Kid, I wouldn't be so sure. But it's your choice." He handed me the mirror. I took in a long breath through the fleshy tear that was acting as my mouth, steeling myself for whatever I was about to see, and held the mirror to my face. The first thing I noticed was my eyes, staring wide with no lids, like two rubber balls sat in a fleshy blob of skin too big for my face. The skin fell away from my face in flaps like oversized jowls. My nose had vanished beneath a mountain of collagen, just a faint mound in the center of my head that lacked any kind of definition. My mouth was the most horrifying of all, just a rough slit, the bottom lip hanging loose and exposing my teeth and raw flesh. My ears were just two long holes now, hanging down to my neck. I almost screamed as I looked on, but kept my composure. I handed the mirror back and said nothing. The doctor opened his mouth to say something, then abruptly got up and walked out of the room, leaving me to my silent horror. The next few days only got worse. They couldn't puncture my skin to inject sedatives or painkillers anymore. Twice a day, they gave me nitrous oxide for anesthesia, then cut new holes in my face. I could feel it growing if I paid attention, noting that my mouth couldn't open as wide as it had just a minute prior. I could see the skin covering my eyes, slowly darkening the edges of my vision little by little. I was in constant agony at this point. As of today, I keep a very sharp knife at my bedside, in case the nurses are too slow to step in. Occasionally, I have to slash open a new mouth in my face to breath. It's been getting harder lately, the skin becoming so thick and dense that I have to place the point in the area between my teeth and hit the handle to puncture its way through. I have gone deaf now. The skin has closed the holes that were my ears and sealed them shut. The skin around my eyes has become too thick to cut without risking damage to them, so I'm blind now as well. I had one of the nurses type this out for me, or at least, I hope she has. I asked her to, and she responded by squeezing my hand twice for yes. I want to make sure my family knows that I don't regret any of this. Even now, I think of Erin and it's all suddenly worth it. I remember when my parents brought her home and told me I was going to be a brother. I was 13 back then. I promised them that I'd make sure nothing ever happened to her, a promise that I'm happy to have kept to the best of my ability. Erin, if you're reading this, just know that I need you to do one thing for me. I need you to have an amazing life. As long as you do that, I'm not worried about anything. I'd run through 1,000 fires to make sure you're safe. Just know that your big brother loves you with all his heart and will always be watching over you. I used to work at a McDonald's next to my neighborhood to supplement my husband's income. Student loans, credit cards, and child rearing all took their financial toll on us, and it soon became inevitable that I would have to get a job to help out, but that's another story altogether. The reason I'm telling you this is because of one particular customer we had during my brief stint working there. A regular. This customer is the reason why I never want to work at a McDonald's ever again. His name was Ryan, a mid-30s, well-to-do bachelor that worked in accounting or something for a big corporation. He would always come in towards evening on my Friday shift, and he would always order the same thing, 1 Big Mac and 1 Happy Meal to go. Well-dressed, well-groomed, but always a little tired. He would make idle conversation as he waited for his food. One time, I asked him why he always ordered a Happy Meal with his Big Mac. "Oh, it's because I have a special little girl waiting at home for me," he said, a weary smile on his face. "She's the reason why I come here every Friday night after work. It's like an early celebration of us spending the whole weekend together." I smiled as I took his order, telling him about my own son at home and how I wished he would never grow up so he could always be my sweet little boy. His face broke into a wide grin. "I hope my little girl never grows up either. I wish she could stay sweet and young forever." That was several weeks ago. Ryan stopped showing up 2 weeks before I quit my job. I didn't think much of it, and was soon caught up in the frantic swing of things again. It wasn't until my husband came home late from work one night, visibly shaken and disturbed, that I realized 2 completely different people from completely different parts of my life would intersect in the most unexpected and horrible way. As I said, my husband came home late, quietly unlocking the door and heading to the kitchen. I put my book down and went downstairs to meet him, making sure not to wake up my sleeping 6-year-old as I passed by his room. I saw my husband looking through the refrigerator, moving things aside as he searched for this night's leftovers. As I watched him, I saw him suddenly stiffen at the sight of my son's Happy Meal box, which contained the few fries and nuggets he hadn't finished from earlier that day. I approached him from behind as I saw him curl his fingers into a fist, slowly pulling away from the bright red box adorned with the iconic golden arches as he rubbed his other hand down his face. I placed a hand on his shoulder, startling him before he realized it was just me. After picking out the Tupperware full of food for him, he thanked me and warmed it up. As he ate, I could feel the distress emanating off of him. Every bite carried a weight to it, every swallow an attempt to force something back down. In bed, I asked him what was wrong, and he broke down and cried. He said he didn't want to tell me, that it wasn't something he should share. This only made me more curious and resolute. I told him it was all right, that I could handle it, and as much as it makes me seem selfish and like a terrible wife, I regret telling him that. I held him in my arms, and he told me about his day. He had gotten a call from dispatch about a disturbance in a neighborhood not far from our own. A concerned neighbor had heard yelling coming from the house next door and called the police to check it out. My husband and his partner arrived at the house in question. There, they knocked on the door and were promptly greeted by a man, clearly agitated and nervous. When questioned, the man tried to brush it off and get them both to leave. That's when they heard it. A scream from deep within the house. The man suddenly pulled out a gun, and they were forced to draw their own. When they tried to tell him to put it down, the man put the gun to his head and pulled the trigger. I squeezed my husband closer, trying my best to comfort him. telling him that what he experienced was clearly traumatizing and his reaction was perfectly normal. That's when his voice changed. It took on a terrible edge as he continued. But that wasn't the worst thing I saw today. And frankly, I'm glad that fucker took his own life. Because when I went further into the house to investigate the source of the scream, I found her. A little girl, no older than 8, tied up in a small room cut off from the outside world. She was crying and absolutely relieved to see us, and I recognized her as one of the children that went missing a few months ago. The condition she was in was horrible, and that's something I really would rather keep to myself. My mouth hung open as I listened to his story, absolutely stunned. I closed my mouth as I processed his words, opening it again to ask a question, but was interrupted as he continued. But the thing that sticks in my mind about all this is that the floor of the room she was in was completely covered in Happy Meal boxes. I went deaf because of a life-threatening brain infection, and I couldn't afford to pay for the implant that would restore my hearing. A nameless organization offered to pay for it, and when I accepted, I started to hear things no person should ever have to hear. Before I start, I'd like to be as transparent as possible. 20 years ago, I was convicted of manslaughter, framed by an organization that took my need and my vulnerability and twisted it to their own ends. I can't right my wrongs, and I know that. I'll live with the consequences of trusting them for the rest of my life. Now that I'm free, though, I've finally decided to put the truth of what happened to me out into the world, which boils down to this. The organization implanted something that allowed me to hear sounds that are normally well out of reach from our perception. Sounds that the human mind wasn't designed to withstand. An imperceptible cacophony that is occurring all around you as you read this. You just don't know it. It's occurring around me as I write this as well, and although I can't physically hear it, I can still feel it. It's faint, but I know it's there. And once I came to understand what they did, they made sure to silence me. November 1, 2002. 10 days before the incident. Ready? I nodded, which was only kind of a lie. I was always ready for this part of my week to be over, but I was never quite ready for the god-awful sensation. Hewitt clicked the remote, and the implant in my left temple whirred to life. It always started gently, a quiet buzzing, irritating, but only mildly so. Inevitably, however, the sound and the vibration crescendoed. What started as a soft hum grew into a furious droning, like a cicada vibrating angry verses from the inside of my skull. Squeezing, squeezing, squeezing until it felt like my skull was. I gritted my teeth and closed my eyes tight. Only a few more seconds. Finally, when I could barely tolerate it anymore, a climatic shockwave radiated from the device, causing my jaw to clack from the force. With the reverberation dissipating as it moved further down my body, the device stilled. A sigh of relief spilled from my lips. I opened my eyes and saw green light reflecting off of Hewitt's thick glasses from the implant's remote. In layman's terms, I'd learned that meant all good. Hewitt smiled, creasing his weathered cheeks. The implant is primed. Let me collect my materials so we can get this show on the road. The stout Italian physician shot up from his desk chair and turned to face the wooden cabinets that lined the back of his office. Despite his advanced age and bulky frame, he was still remarkably spry. Thanks. By the way, I don't think I'll ever be ready for that, Doc. For any of this, actually. You can probably stop asking. Save your breath, I mean. As I spoke, it felt like heavy grains of sand were swimming around my molars. I swished the pebbles onto my tongue and spat them into my hand, frowning at the chalky crystals in my palm. Jesus, cracked another filling. Does the audiology department have a P.O. box I can forward my dental bills to? He chuckled weakly as he turned back towards me. The old doctor was only half listening, now preoccupied with assembling the familiar experimental setup. Carefully, he placed a Buddha statue, a spray bottle of clear liquid, 4 half-foot-tall metal pillars, and a capped Petri dish on the desk. Absent-mindedly, I rubbed the scar above my temple. Most of the time, I just pretended like I could perceive the outline of the dime-sized implant. The delusion helped me feel in control, but I wasn't in control. Not completely, at least. I shared control with the remote in Hewitt's hand, especially when his part of the implant was active, the experimental portion. Suppressing the existential anxiety that came with split dominance was challenging. I wasn't used to my sensations being a democracy. The concession felt worth it, though. The implant restored my hearing, and Hewitt installed it free with a single string attached. I had to play ball with these weekly sessions, testing the part of the implant that I wasn't allowed to know anything about, per our agreement. On the desk, the doctor was arranging the metal pillars into a small square. Once satisfied with the dimensions of the square, he'd position the statue, the spray bottle, and the petri dish into the center of it. Then, testing would finally begin. "So, are your other patients tolerating this thing okay?" I asked, fishing for a few reassuring words. The doctor looked up from his designs, pointing a brown iris and a bushy white eyebrow at me. "There are no other patients like you, David." He paused for a moment, maintaining unbroken eye contact, as if to highlight the importance of what just came out of his mouth. Abruptly, he severed his gaze and resumed fidgeting with the metal pillars, but he continued to talk. "Your case, this situation, it's unique. A marriage of circumstances. When the brain infection took your hearing, any model of cochlear implant could have been used to repair it, but you couldn't afford them, not even the cheapest one. At the exact same time, my lab was looking for an elegant solution to our own problem. A friend of a friend was aware of both of our dilemmas. You needed an implant for free, and we needed it." He stopped talking mid-sentence and swiveled his head around the setup, examining it from different angles and elevations, but he made no further modifications. It seemed like everything was in its right place. Contented, he sat back down in his chair, and briefly, Hewitt was motionless. He looked either lost in his thoughts, captivated by things he'd rather not say out loud, or he was resting and not thinking about anything at all. Either way, it took a moment for him to remember he had been explaining something to me. My confused facial expression probably sped that process along. "Right, we needed a..." He trailed off, wringing his hand to convey he was searching for the correct word in English. "We needed an operator. Someone to tell us that the device worked like we had designed it to. I wouldn't say this was an elegant solution, but we're both getting something out of the deal, I suppose." In the 9 months since the implantation, this was by far the most Hewitt ever divulged about the deeper contents of their arrangement. As requested, he didn't check if I was ready this time. Instead, he winked and clicked another button on the remote. "What do you hear?" Instantly, I could hear sound emanating from each of the stationary objects in the middle of the square. Nothing moved, and yet a loud, rhythmic drumming filled my ears. Despite being able to tell the noise was coming from directly in front of me, it sounded incredibly distant too, like it was echoing from the depths of a massive cave system before it reached me standing at the cave's entrance. What started a single drum eventually became a frenzied ensemble. Over only a few seconds, hundreds of drum rolls layered over each other until the chaotic pounding caused my head to throb. The Buddha was grinning, but that's not what I heard. I heard the marble figure screaming at me, its voice made of deafening thunder rather than anything recognizably human. I cradled my temple with my palm and grimaced, shouting in answer to Hewitt's question. "I'll think things are drumming, same as always, Doc." He clicked the remote again, and like the flick of a switch, the objects became silent immediately. "Thank you, David. Head to the lobby, grab a book, and have Anne-Marie make you a cup of coffee. In about an hour, I'll call you back. We'll repeat the procedure, I'll deactivate the implant, and you'll be done for the week." My legs pulled my body out of the chair without a shred of hesitation. I was dying to leave the office and get some fresh air. As my hand gripped the doorknob, however, Hewitt's words rang in my head. "There are no other patients like you, David." I turned back to the doctor, who was now spraying down the statue with the unknown liquid. "Hewitt, you mentioned something when we first met in the hospital, about our contract. You said that eventually you'd be able to explain to me what we're doing here. I know I've never brought it up before now. I think I used to be more scared of knowing than I was of being left in the dark. And, well, I've sort of been feeling the opposite way as of late. Is that option still on the table? Although he interrupted what he was doing, he didn't meet my gaze. Instead, he kept his focus on the statue and muttered a half-hearted response. I can appeal to the board. No promises, David. When I returned an hour later, the objects and the pillars were in their same positions, but the Buddha had a new, glistening shine on its marble skin. As the device activated, the horrible drumming reappeared, but only from the spray bottle and the petri dish. The statue remained eerily quiet. Hewitt clicked the remote one last time. The implant beeped 3 times and then released one last shockwave, weaker than the one that came with priming his part of the device. This supposedly meant the implant had completely deactivated its experimental portion. I was told the designers never intended me to experience the drumming outside a controlled setting. Well, that's all for today. You have my cell phone number. I may not always be able to answer, but call me if there are any issues. Feel free to leave a message as well. He shook my hand, forced a smile, and then waved me out of his office. As I turned to leave, my eyes fell on the gleaming statue still sitting on his desk. Although the silence better matched the figure's smile, I couldn't help but feel like it was still screaming, berating me for being so naive. I just couldn't hear it anymore. Below, I've typed out what I can recall of the messages I left for Hewitt leading up to my indictment. Here's what I remember. November 5th, 2002, 6 days before the incident. Me. Hey Hewitt, first off, everything is okay. I know I've never called you on your cell before, so I don't want you to think there's a big emergency or something. I mean, there kind of was, but I'm all right. I was in a car accident. Drunk driver fell asleep at the wheel, swerved into traffic, and I T-boned him. Not sure he walked away from the wreck, but I'm hanging in there, all things considered. Just a broken rib and a nasty concussion on my end. Banged the side of my head against the steering wheel pretty hard. Still hearing everything okay, so I'm assuming the device is working fine, but I figured with the head injury, you might want to know. Especially since our next appointment isn't for another week. Give me a call back at 555-239-7648 when you can. November 6th, 5 days before. Me. Got your machine again, I guess. Haven't heard from you, so I suppose you aren't too worried about me or the implant, which is good, but maybe you should be. I am, after last night. I started hearing the drumming at home, just little bits of it here and there, much quieter than usual. I was sitting at my computer, and I heard it in the background of the music I was listening to. It just kind of appeared. I'm not sure how long it was there before I noticed it. At first I thought I was hearing things, but as I walked through my apartment, it became louder. Muffled, though. Felt like it was coming from multiple places rather than one. Eventually I thought I tracked it to a drawer in my kitchen, but when I pulled it open, it stopped, all of a sudden. I guess it could be the concussion, but the noise is so distinctive. An invisible jackhammer banging into invisible concrete, like I've told you. Anyway. Just call me back. Oh, before I forget, have you heard from the board? I'd really like to know what this thing does, in addition to my hearing, I mean. November 8, 3 days before. Me. Doc, where the fuck are you? Sorry, didn't mean to lose my temper. I haven't slept. Can the implant turn on by itself? I'm definitely hearing whatever I'm being trained to hear. It's everywhere. Comes and goes at random, or maybe I'm just starting to hear it when I face it a certain way. My head, it feels like an antenna. If I turn my head up and to the left, it all goes away. Any other position though, and I can hear the drumming. Like I said, everywhere. On my phone, my clothes, the walls. I heard it inside myself too. I managed to fall asleep, but I guess I relaxed, and my muscles relaxed, and, well, my head must have turned, because I could hear it again, loud as hell. from the inside of my mouth. I'm not proud, but I kind of freaked out, put my hands in my mouth and just scraping. I wanted it out of me, dug at my gums. It's really bad. I can't drive either. I mean, I can try, but I feel like I'll just get in another wreck trying to keep my head up and to the left while driving, and what if it still happens? Even though my head's in the right place, please, please call me. November 10, one day before. Me. I've started to feel it all, Hewitt. The drumming, it's moving over everything. It's in everything. It breaks you and then it rebuilds you again. And now I have only one sense, not five. I don't see, I don't taste, smell, touch, and I certainly don't hear, not anymore. But I feel the current. I feel it writhing and pounding and slipping and fucking and expanding and consuming and living and dying over every goddamned thing. It speaks to me, not in a language or a tongue. It's a tide. It ebbs and flows. It sings wordless songs to me. And I understand now. I thought you cursed me, Hewitt, but all transitions cause pain. I mean, how do you turn a liquid into a gas? You boil it. And when it bubbles its tiny pleading screams, you certainly don't stop. You turn up the heat. November 11, day of the incident. Me. Hello? David, are you at home? Me. Doc, oh thank God you gotta help me. Oh God, it's everywhere. I'm nothing. Paul Hewitt, can you get to the... He cut him off. Me, please, make it stop. Why doesn't it ever stop? Hewitt. David, I need you to calm down. Me, am I hearing death, Hewitt? Can God hear what I can hear, Doc, or are they too scared? Hewitt, you're hearing the microscopic, David. It was all just supposed to be a novel way to test the effectiveness of anti-infectious agents. Once they stopped moving, we know the medication killed them. We stood to make a lot of money off of the technology, but we couldn't prove it worked. Not until you. You've helped so many people, David. Me, I've been able to hear, able to feel the billions of living things moving around, on my skin, inside me, everywhere. Hewitt, don't call an ambulance, don't call the police. We're coming to pick you up. I don't remember much from that night other than this conversation. I can vaguely recall Hewitt arriving at my apartment, remote in hand. He examines my head, and I'm fading in and out of consciousness. When I fully come to, I'm lying on my couch, holding a gun I'd never seen before. A few steps away is Hewitt's corpse, and I start crying, not out of fear or confusion, out of relief. It's finally quiet, silent as the grave. The endless drumming of infinite microorganisms crawling around me and within me had vanished. Just then, my weeping is interrupted by a man rounding the corner into my living room. He's well-dressed, with dark blue eyes, and he walks over to sit next to me, stepping over Hewitt as he does. He introduces himself as Hewitt, tells me the body won't be needing the name anymore, so it's his now. Listen, David, we have some new terms. You can still keep the device, meaning you can keep your hearing. It's fixed now too. You won't be hearing anything you weren't meant to hear from now until the day you die. As with any fair deal, I have some conditions. You can't tell anyone what you heard, and you have to take the fall for the killing of the nameless body in front of you. If you do those things, you'll be safe. Fail to abide by those conditions, and we're turning the noise back on. All of it. And we'll leave it on, up until the moment you choke on your own tongue. Not a second sooner. Do you understand, David? I agreed to the terms then, but I've had a little change of heart. Jail gave me perspective. You see, the punishment behind incarceration is that you lose your autonomy. That's your incentive to reform. Serve your time, play by the rules, and hey, maybe we'll give you your agency back. Maybe you'll have an opportunity to own your body again. It makes you realize that agency and autonomy are the only things that really have value in this world. Without them, you have nothing. And what is this implant but another jail? I've wanted to speak up for so damn long, but the threat of being subjected to the drumming again has kept me silent. Well, I've changed. I'm tired of just settling for what they'll give me. I want my goddamned agency back. So, to the creators of the implant, consider this my resignation from our contract. In addition, I have a few choice words. I am relying on the internet to carry them to you, wherever you are. Do your worst, motherfuckers. I get paid to scare people. This time I wasn't the one doing the scaring. People pay me to scare them, not in a fun, haunted house kind of way. My job is more personal, tailored. I find what gets under your skin and make it real, at least for a little while. Some people get a rush from it, others just want to feel something. I have rules though. I never touch anyone, I never actually break anything, and I never, ever take a job unless I know every detail first. So when I got a job offer from an anonymous client willing to pay double my usual rate, I should have known something was off. Make him believe the house is haunted, the client said. Make him believe something's inside with him. Easy enough. I'd done it 100 times before. The house was an old Victorian on the edge of town, isolated, surrounded by overgrown trees that swallowed the streetlights. The kind of place that already felt haunted. The client's brother had moved in a week prior. No family, no visitors, just him alone in a big house. Perfect target. I arrived at midnight. No car in the driveway, no lights on. I picked the lock easily. This wasn't breaking and entering. Not really. I was invited. The second I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The air was thick, wrong, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. It smelled faintly sweet, like rotting fruit and something else. Something wet and metallic. I brushed it off and got to work. I started with small things. Shifted furniture just slightly. Left doors half open. Whispered through the vents just enough to make the air hum. Simple tricks, things that get into your head and make you question what you know you did. Then I heard it, a shuffle of movement from upstairs. I froze. The client said his brother would be home, but I hadn't seen any sign of him. No shoes by the door, no dishes in the sink. The house felt empty. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming down the stairs. I held my breath and pressed myself into the shadows. I've been caught before, but I know how to hide. My eyes adjusted, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't a man, not anymore. A thing stood at the top of the stairs. A twisted, grotesque version of a human, its body unnaturally long and skeletal. Its skin was translucent, stretched tight over elongated limbs, veins pulsing beneath like they were about to burst. It had the twisted frame of a human but spindly legs like an insect's, ending in sharp, twitching talons that scraped against the wooden floor. Its body was covered in a fine, oily black fur that glistened in the dim light. Its face was where the nightmare began. A massive, bulbous head with too many eyes, glassy and black, flickered all over its skin. They weren't arranged neatly like a spider's. They were scattered in irregular patterns, one near its jaw, another on its forehead, some just under its chin, blinking in a maddening, unpredictable rhythm. The thing's mouth. No, it wasn't a mouth. It was a horrific, churning mass of jagged, needle-like teeth, all constantly moving as if they were fighting to break free from its face. It opened impossibly wide, its jaw unhinging like a snake's, stretching down to its chest. Then I saw its hands. Its hands were wrong in a way that made my stomach twist. They weren't hands at all. They were spider legs, long, segmented, and twitching. They were like thick, black antennae that twitched with violent energy, bending and unfurling as they scraped against the wall. I could feel the heat in my throat rise. I should have turned and run. I should have done anything but stay frozen. But the thing wasn't finished. It tilted its head. The sound of its neck cracking echoed through the house like dry twigs snapping underfoot. Then it spoke. Its voice wasn't human. It sounded like a distorted, garbled hiss mixed with a sharp, skittering click, like the sound of 1,000 bugs crawling in the dark. "You shouldn't have come Before I could even process the words, the thing lunged, but not with speed. It moved in jerks like it was still learning how to control its body. Its legs clicked and bent with disturbing precision, the long, sharp appendages scraping against the floor with every movement. My body moved before my brain could catch up. I ran. I bolted toward the door, and the sound of it pursuing, scratching, scraping, skittering was deafening. Every part of me screamed to get out, to survive. Then, just as my hand gripped the door handle, the lights went out. The house went black. I couldn't see. I couldn't breathe. My heart thundered in my ears as I fumbled in the dark, and that's when I felt it. Ice-cold legs crawling across my back, their jagged tips scraping my skin like they were testing the flesh. I wrenched open the door and tore through the hallway, not looking back. I don't know how I got to the car, my hands so slick with sweat I could hardly grip the wheel. But I know one thing. As I pulled out of the driveway, I looked in the rearview mirror. That thing was standing at the top of the stairs, its eyes flashing in the window. It tilted its head and, with one last horrifying click, smiled. I left town that same night, the cold fear still crawling under my skin. I haven't stopped driving. I haven't looked back, and I swear I will never, ever scare anyone again. Mary Keller sat back in her armchair, a lit cigarette perched between her shaky fingers. She stared at the unassuming man sat across from her, her eyes threatening to spill the tears she'd held back all night. "So," Mary said, taking a long drag, "this is it then?" "Yes, ma'am," the man said calmly, his hands placed atop his crossed knees. "Please." She sucked in a breath, a quiet sob escaping her lips. She pleaded with the man, hoping she could get more time. "Please let me have a few more years. I'm not ready to go." "Mary, you signed a contract." "I know, I signed the goddamn contract. I was desperate. I didn't know what else to do." She placed her head in her hands and wept, the man patiently waiting for her speak again. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand and placed her cigarette, still smoking, into the ashtray. The man stood and offered a hand to her. "What's it like?" she whispered, taking his hand. The man laughed, guttural and deep. "It's hell, Mary. What do you think it's like?" Sheriff Thompson stepped out of his patrol vehicle with a grunt, being met by one of the officers on scene. "What we got?" "Human remains. We found a hand. Looks to be a woman's hand by the size and wedding ring. The neighbors found it and called." With a nod, Sheriff Thompson walked into the house and was met with a pristine living room save for a slightly scorched armchair, a pile of ash, and a human hand. He stared, brow furrowed, confused as to how nothing else was burned. The faint smell of burnt hair and sulfur lingered in the air. "Where's the ash from?" he asked as he smeared some between his fingers, noticing the strange grit within them. "Don't know. There's no ashes anywhere else. None in the fireplace either. Just some cigarette ash in the ashtray." Where's the neighbors?" He was directed to the front lawn where Mr. Webb stood, a haggard man looking to be about 70, arms crossed over his chest. "Mr. Webb, I'm Sheriff Thompson. I've heard you're the one who called. Can you walk me through what you found?" "Yes, sir. Well, me and my wife was having supper, and we heard Mary yellin'. I look out my front window and don't see nothing amiss, so we go back to eatin'. Couple minutes go by and we hear Mary just a-screamin'. I run over here and knock on her door, but she don't answer. So I open her door and call her name, but don't get no answer. I walk in a little ways and see a hand on that chair. Oh, I run back to my house and call the law. Now we standin' here talkin'. Did Mary have any visitors tonight that you saw?" "No, Mary don't keep no company. She keep to herself most days. We see her getting the mail on Tuesdays, but not much else. She lived in that house with her mama and daddy. When they passed on, she stayed there. Me and my wife bought this house right before Mary had her boy. We known her a long time." "Is she married? Kids?" "She had a husband and long while ago, but he died shortly after their boy was born. Had a work accident of some kind. 2 years after her husband died, her boy got sick. Doctors didn't know what was wrong, just that he wasn't gonna survive it. Some kind of cancer, they reckon, but don't rightly know." Mary did a lot of praying back then, and I guess the good Lord answered her prayers because her boy lived. One day he's dying, the next day he's not. Sheriff Thompson scribbled notes into his notebook, listening as the old man recounted the story. Where's her son now? He moved up north about 25 years ago, got married, had his own kids. He ain't been back here since, far as I know, except for Christmas time every couple years. Got him a good job, some kind of law office or other. Sheriff finished his notes and closed his book, tucking it into his breast pocket. Thank you, sir. You can go on home now. We'll come see you if we need you again. Mr. Webb nodded, walking back to his house. Sheriff Thompson went back into Mary's, continuing his observation of the scene. The sheriff walks into the coroner's office, handing him a cup of coffee. Thank you, Sheriff. The coroner took a long drink from his cup as he sat down at his desk to go over his findings. So these pictures here, the armchair and the floor in front of the couch, these were the only areas burned? Yes, Josiah. Nothing else was touched anywhere, and we went through that house twice. Josiah scratched his beard stubble as he handed the pictures to the sheriff. The ashes found with the hand are human remains. We contacted Mary's son so that we can get him here to test his DNA against the hand and the ashes. They look to have been cremated, but there's no sign of foul play or a break-in. And any fire hot enough to burn a body to ash would have sent that whole house up in flames, not singed the chair and the floor. And it damn sure wouldn't have left a hand behind cauterized at the wrist. Even if her cigarette had an ember fly off, it wouldn't have burned her body up like that. It doesn't make any goddamn sense, Josiah. We've been going over this case for weeks, and not a goddamn bit if it makes sense. Josiah sat back, placing his interlaced fingers behind his head. Sheriff, I've been talking to some colleagues of mine about this to get their opinion because I was stumped too. Let me ask you something. Have you ever heard of spontaneous human combustion? Growing up, I hated the summers. My friends and classmates would start the new school year going on and on about the fun things they did during break, like going to water parks, rec centers, or going to a camp where they told scary stories around the fire and ate marshmallows. I had nothing to share. From the time I was in first grade till the time I was in fourth grade, my stories were boring and mundane. That is, until one year, when I was 11, and I came back with a story that was not fun or boring at all, but absolutely terrifying. My summer breaks sucked, because my parents would always send me to my grandfather's, a tradition that started for seemingly no reason. He lived a couple of towns away, his old Victorian house surrounded by farmland, looking for all the world like the place from the first Conjuring movie. There was even a creepy forest of birch trees and a still, murky pond nearby. Grandpa was a tall, skinny and pale man with a bald head that reminded me of a big speckled egg, large hooked nose that reminded me of a witch's, and beady, dark eyes that never seemed to sparkle with joy at anything, not even the sight of his grandson, who he only saw once a year. He dressed in dull colors all the time, sweater vests and button-ups, with these slacks I thought people only wore when they went to church or attended a funeral. He was quiet and clearly didn't like people. He would yell at any visitors and had a beware of dog sign, even though he hated dogs. He had no pets. The sign was just to ward off trespassers. Living there for a few consecutive months was torturous for a modern kid like I was. His TV was one of the few left that had a large back and an antenna. Most channels were not available, and whatever kids' show I could watch were either super religious, like poorly animated Bible stories, or lame learning programs for toddlers like Coco Melon but somehow more unbearable and from the 90s. The only other things I could do was either read a book, play with the 2 toys I was allowed to bring, or go outside and play. Not before doing my chores, though, of course. Each Sunday he took me to a church in the closest town, and throughout the week he forced me to assist him with various volunteer jobs here and there, like at the soup kitchen or handing out resources to the homeless outside. I know that doesn't sound too bad, but being out in the sweltering sun with absolutely no shade, handing out sample deodorants and food cans to the needy, was hellish for a kid who just wanted to watch cable TV and play his Nintendo DS that he sadly had to leave at home. Every night we prayed before bed and said grace before every meal. The meals themselves were quite bland. My parents were great cooks, and all his food was poorly seasoned in comparison, and mostly boiled until they took on a pale, unappetizing color. While he wasn't the most affectionate grandfather in the world, I did have the sense that he cared for me. He just was one of those people who didn't exactly know how to show it, I guess. He always asked if my dinner was good after I ate the last bite, and I always lied and told him yes. He would also ask if I wanted to hear a bedtime story, but I always said no and reminded him that I was too old for them, or at least I had thought as much. The summer before I would start 5th grade, something unexplainable happened. He changed when my mom dropped me off, parking her beat-up Cadillac in the yard and pushing me towards the door. I felt something was off about the whole place. I couldn't put my finger on it, and I remember looking around as Mom and I stood on the porch and she knocked and knocked to no answer, and thinking, it's so quiet. I didn't hear birds or squirrels. The breeze we felt earlier was gone, meaning the trees were still, and I couldn't hear toads croaking by the pond. Finally, Grandpa answered the door, peeking through a crack. He looked shaken. There was an expression on his face I'd never seen before. He seemed paler than usual, and his eyes were opened a little wider than necessary. He looked at us as if he'd forgotten that we were coming, as if I hadn't come on the same day every year, as if Mom hadn't spoken to him over the phone a week in advance like she does each time. "Dad, are you okay?" Mom asked. Grandpa blinked, as if coming back to reality. He shook his head and opened the door wider. "Sorry, I was only sleeping." I immediately knew he had to be lying. He always got up at the same time and stayed awake all throughout the day until bedtime. He always stuck to a strict routine, and if anything threw him off that routine, he would get angry and become silent for the whole day. Like always, Mom stayed long enough to have lunch with us at the long, rectangular dining table Grandpa had. I always thought it was funny how big it was, considering he lived alone. Apparently his wife, my grandma, died before I was born. Anyway, we ate tuna sandwiches cut into neat triangles with toothpicks spearing olives sticking out of them, drank prune juice, and Mom was on her way. I was prepared for another uninteresting summer, wishing I was riding roller coasters or swimming in community pools like my friends. Things started to get strange a couple of days in. I woke up at 6 a.m. because I was pretty much forced to. He had set the alarm clock on my night table to ring at that time, same as his. After cleaning up and dressing, I went downstairs to watch the old TV while I waited for Grandpa to start cooking breakfast as always. 2 hours in, my eyes glued to the screen, I suddenly became painfully aware of the fact that I couldn't hear Grandpa walking around, nor did I hear food cooking. I stood up from my spot sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, and when I turned around, my heart stopped. Grandpa was standing there, behind the couch, still in his striped pajamas. He stared at me with these soulless eyes, his mouth partially open as if I was some weird specimen he hadn't seen before, and it disgusted him. How long had he been like that, and why wasn't he dressed yet? He loved routine, so why did he break it? Grandpa, I was concerned for him after I got over the initial shock of seeing him standing there. He was old, but his mind was actually quite sharp. He had never done anything like this before. He didn't say anything, just stared, as if looking through me. "Grandpa?" I said more urgently, wondering if I needed to call someone. "More?" "What?" I frowned. "More what?" He seemed to snap out of it then. His eyes blinked rapidly, and he finally seemed to look as if he could actually register my existence. He looked down at himself and started grumbling in frustration. "Damn it!" I watched him march upstairs to go change. Honestly, I didn't know what to think of what just happened. I got over it pretty quickly. I mean, yeah, it was weird, but I trusted him and figured he just had a brain fart or something. We had a late breakfast, during which he pushed his food around, muttering under his breath about something I couldn't make out. I swallowed the runny poached eggs and got the courage to ask, "Grandpa, "Is something wrong? I just haven't gotten much sleep lately." He waved me away, looking grouchy and not even making eye contact with me. "Don't worry about it. Are we doing anything today?" I was so bored I was actually looking forward to charity work. "No, I'm going back to bed. I don't feel well." Grandpa got up, angrily wiping his mouth with a napkin, and stormed upstairs. I was left there, feeling uncomfortable, wondering if I did something to make him angry. He stayed in bed all day, and when I tried to wake him to make dinner when evening came, he told me to make myself a ham sandwich and put myself to bed. Instead, I went outside to explore. I stood by the pond and skipped rocks, wondering if I could use everything that was happening as a way to get out of coming there next year. A creeping sense of unease came over me as I realized, once again, how eerily quiet it was. I didn't hear any bugs, animals, or anything like usual. In fact, there were quite a lot of dead frogs, turtles, and lizards floating along the pond's surface, more than what felt normal. By the tree where an old tire swing hung, a bird lay on its back, rotting next to cracked little eggshells. I tried not to think about it as I searched for more rocks to throw. I wanted to believe I was too old to get scared by such things. What I couldn't ignore, however, was the bubbling sound in the pond. Where one of the rocks I threw landed, far out into the middle, the water bubbled a little. Then ripples formed a V shape, traveling towards the shore in my direction, as if something under the surface was swimming towards me. I won't give away the region I live in, but we don't have many gators or crocs around here, and judging by the movement of the water, it seemed too big to be anything else. I turned and ran to the house. When I made it to the porch, I spared a quick look at the same time as I opened the door. Now there was a split second between me looking and me running into the house. During that very short time frame, I could have sworn I thought I saw something round poking out of the water, close to shore. It didn't look anything like a gator. In fact, it almost seemed like the upper half of a head sticking out and peering at me, like someone was swimming in that dirty, old, still pond. When I went into Grandpa's room to alert him, he was already awake, standing at his window looking down into the yard. His window faced the pond, so I wondered if he could see it. But when I stood beside him and followed his gaze all the way down to the water, I saw nothing. He didn't say anything. He was staring into space again. "Grandpa, is there something in the pond?" I asked, still breathing hard from running. He didn't answer me. "Grandpa, answer me. I'm getting scared." "Meat." "What?" I shook his arm, watching his stoic expression for any sign of emotion. After a second, he turned to me quickly, as if only just realizing I was there beside him. In the blink of an eye, his face turned red and veins bulged in his forehead. "Go clean the kitchen, boy." I was taken aback by his hostile tone that came out of nowhere. So much so that I said nothing and left to do as he said. He didn't ask if I wanted to be told a bedtime story that night, nor did he pray with me. In fact, all I could hear until I finally passed out from exhaustion was him pacing his bedroom floor aggressively, ranting loud enough for me to hear but not loud enough for me to know what he was talking about. Whatever it was, it had him madder than I'd ever seen him. The next morning, I could hear Grandpa in the kitchen. This made me happy as I got up to brush my teeth, because I thought since he was back into his routine, then that must have meant he was feeling better. As I went downstairs, I smiled, hearing him humming a tune to an old song playing from his radio, but my smile disappeared as the stench of smoke hit my nose. Grandpa slammed plates of overcooked food down on the table with such hostility it made me jump. Despite the anger in his actions, he had a small smile on his wrinkled face, not a big one, a simple, tiny curl of his thin lips. He didn't once look at me as he started digging into the blackened and charred eggs and grits on his plate with a knife and fork. He ate with such gusto, humming louder and louder between bites, his movements becoming faster and more frenzied. He sliced and sliced with his knife and stabbed with his fork, the sound of the metal scraping against china grating my ears. I watched him, too afraid to ask what was wrong and too afraid to leave the table, because I knew the rule was that I had to be excused first, and I didn't want to make him angrier. I remembered something then. "Grandpa, we didn't say grace." I flinched when his eyes met mine and all movement on him ceased. He didn't say anything for a moment, but then he returned to his regular self, no creepy smile and no anger, and nodded at me while patting his mouth with a napkin. If anything, he seemed sheepish that he'd forgotten. "Good boy for remembering. It's not too late. Go on, it's your turn this time." I closed my eyes and pressed my hands together before reciting the words I'd memorized years ago. God is good. God is great. Thank you for this bountiful food, and thank you for keeping us healthy and safe. As I prayed, I felt the hairs rise on the back of my neck. Something felt utterly wrong. I cracked open one eye. "And thank you for..." Grandpa wasn't praying with me at all. His eyes weren't closed and his head wasn't bowed. His hands rested on the table as he glared at me with such a deep hatred and vitriol that I feared for my life for the first time ever. His fingers rested tensely on his fork, twitching like they itched to grab it and plunge it into my body. Even if it weren't for his expression, something about the fact that he was staring at me like that as I prayed, during a time where his eyes were meant to be closed in prayer with me, made me deeply uncomfortable. What had I done that was so wrong? I started to tear up a little. I got up from the table, no longer caring about the rule. "I'm not hungry, I'm going to my room." He watched me with his unwavering, rage-filled gaze, not bothering to respond. His eyes never left me until I turned the corner down the hall. Shutting myself in my room, I tried to think of what to do. I thought of calling my mom using the landline in the kitchen, but would he even let me? I stayed there, reading a book, when I heard slow, methodical footsteps approach the door. I could see the shadows of Grandpa's feet through the crack under it. The doorknob turned, but of course, I had locked the door because I didn't want him to bother me, so he wasn't able to get in. "Grandpa?" "Please?" "What?" "Please let him in." I mustered the courage to defy him and said in a loud voice, "Leave me alone." A beat of silence passed. "I'm not your grandfather, you little piece of shit." My mouth fell open. He'd never sworn at me like that before, not even when I broke a plate or stepped on his bad foot. His voice was low, raspy, and deeper than it usually was. I listened to the sound of him walking away, back down the hall towards his own room. I needed to call my mom. I waited until I was sure he wasn't coming back out anytime soon, and then I crept into the hall and made my way quietly into the kitchen. I remembered Mom's phone number by heart, so I punched it into the keys and held the white phone to my ear as it rang. My hands were sweaty, and I felt like every little creak of the house settling was actually my grandfather coming. "Hello? Mom?" I whispered, looking over my shoulder. "Grandpa's acting weird. I don't want to stay here anymore. Can you come get me today?" "Eric, what are you talking about? Your father and I are too busy to pick you up. We planned this summer last year. I think he has some old people sickness or something," I said, trying to remember the term dementia or Alzheimer's at the time. "He's freaking me out. I can't stay here for a whole summer. Please pick me up. I'm scared." "Honey, your father and I are in New York City. We're going to board the ship tomorrow morning at the port. We can't come get you." "What's going on?" "I don't know. He's angry all the time and keeps staring at nothing. And he keeps trying to get into my room. Baby, he's a grumpy old man, you know this. And, wait, trying to get into your room? Eric, did you lock your door? You know that's against the rules." "Yeah, I locked it because he's being weird. And..." I heard a floorboard groan ever so slightly behind me, and I turned around, dropping the phone. It clacked against the wall, hanging by the cord. Grandpa was standing in the kitchen entrance, completely blocking the way out, and staring with that empty, dead, slack-jawed expression from before. "Eric? Eric?" Mom's voice came from the phone. The corners of Grandpa's lips yanked up into a demented smile, showing yellowed, rotten teeth I don't remember him having. In fact, I specifically remembered that he always prided himself in his hygiene and meticulously brushed and flossed his teeth twice, sometimes even 3 times a day. Now they looked like they were ready to fall out, brown ooze dripping from the top row. He advanced towards me, shuffling like a zombie, and I let out a little yelp and dodged him, running out of the way. I turned and realized, my heart going wild in my chest, that he wasn't after me. He simply went over and picked up the phone, slowly bringing it up to his face, his eyes more dark and cold than a shark's, never leaving mine. "Charlene?" I stood in the kitchen entryway and listened to their conversation, feeling more helpless than ever. "Oh no need to worry yourself, my dear. All is fine and well. The boy and I simply had a disagreement." He grinned at me as he saw my face fall. "Oh yes, I'll make sure he behaves from now on. You just relax at home. Okay, take care." He placed the phone back on the receiver and just stood there, in that same position, baring his gnarly teeth at me sadistically, as if breathing in my fear. There were no words. I simply turned around and hurried back to my room. I felt his stare burning holes into my back as I did. Once I locked the door behind me, I crawled into bed and pulled the covers up to my neck. The sun was setting outside, and I knew it would be hard getting to sleep that night. At around 1 a.m., I found myself starting to drift off finally, until I heard noises in the living room. I couldn't help it. I was too curious and figured I could be stealthy enough to not be caught out of my room at this hour. I snuck down to the center of the stairway and watched Grandpa in the middle of the dining room, surrounded by broken and knocked over furniture, tearing into one of the steaks he'd left to thaw out the previous day. He was naked as the day he was born, and standing there in the dark, hunched over, tearing into bloody red slabs of raw meat with his rotten teeth like a savage animal. He was even grunting and growling under his breath as he did it. I didn't know what to do or say. I definitely didn't want him to know I was there, and I was afraid to go back up the stairs in fear I made a noise that would alert him to my presence. The air in the house felt freezing cold, when normally Grandpa kept it hot, and there was a bad odor that couldn't just be explained by him not showering in a while or something. It smelled like rot, and it certainly wasn't the once frozen meat. I also noticed that the things that were hanging on the dining room wall had been taken down. The Last Supper painting was lying on the floor with rips and punctures in it, and the holy crosses lying there with it, burned in some places as if he'd held a lighter to them or something. Above all, the detail that stood out the most to me was that he was soaking wet. Now, I hadn't heard the bath running at all, so the only other explanation was that he'd been in the pond. The dirty, wet footprints leading from the slightly ajar front door supported my theory. It was then that I knew for sure that something paranormal may have been happening to him. This was beyond an episode of dementia or something, or at least that's what my preteen brain thought at the time, since Grandpa was extremely religious and would not dare do that to the symbols of Christianity around his house. This had to be related to the thing I saw in the pond. I started slowly making my way back up the stairs. Thankfully, he didn't hear me, and I carefully shut the door and locked it. Once that was done, I quietly started gathering my things. I changed out of my pajamas into street clothes I would feel comfortable running in, and packed my backpack so I wouldn't have to return. My plan was to go to the neighbors a couple miles up the road. I never met them. I just saw the house pass by during trips in the car with Grandpa, and saw that it was a family with 2 parents and a couple of kids too young for school. I was going to tell them that I felt unsafe and that Grandpa needed help, and give them my mom's number. All I had to do to make this plan work was get out of the house without him noticing me. I waited in bed for a couple of hours until I heard all the noises cease. I wasn't out of the clear entirely though, because Grandpa didn't go back upstairs to sleep in his room. I heard him open the front door, and it seemed like he hadn't returned by then. I looked out my window, which faced the side of the yard where the pond started, but saw nothing. I even opened the window a crack to see if I could hear him out there. But I heard nothing. Absolutely zilch. Not even crickets and cicadas chirping, an owl, a bat, nothing at all. I ran until I couldn't feel my legs, and my lungs felt like raisins. I heard wet feet slapping the asphalt behind me as something followed me, but I didn't dare look. Eventually the sounds faded away, but I couldn't tell if it was because he stopped chasing me or because of how loud my heart was pumping in my ears. It felt like a lifetime until I reached that house I remember seeing. The lights in the windows slowly turned on as I banged on the door urgently, crying for help. This area was more lively, with fireflies glowing and toads croaking and general nightlife chorusing around me as it should. The mom and dad of that family let me sit on the couch and gave me something to eat and drink as they called my parents and the police. Arguably, this is the worst part of the story, even though it takes place after I escaped. When the police came to check on my grandpa, they didn't find him in the house at all. He was in the pond and he was dead. He had been dead for quite a while, actually, since the night I came, which obviously didn't make sense, but the evidence was there. His corpse was decayed, the process being hastened by the hot summer sun, naked and bloated as it bobbed in the pond. My family didn't sugarcoat this to me at all, being that I kept insisting the police were wrong and that he was alive that night. I brought up the phone call and Mom denied it even more. She refuses to believe that even happened, to the point she yells at me when I bring it up. Dad told me she was drinking that night I called. They were celebrating before getting on the cruise. He thinks I impersonated Grandpa and that she was so drunk she thought I was actually him. I thought she sounded pretty sober though. I think deep down she knows something paranormal was happening, but doesn't want to face it. My mom also told me when my dad wasn't around that Grandma died by drowning in that very same pond. It confused everyone because she never attempted swimming in it and she didn't have anything wrong with her mentally. Yet it seemed like she intended to jump in, as she'd taken off her clothes and socks and shoes and neatly folded them on the bank. She was found floating in the center with a look of slack-jawed confusion on her face, same as Grandpa years later. Mom believes that she committed suicide because she was unhappy with Grandpa for a long time. She believes Grandpa killed himself too, and my brain made me hallucinate that he was still alive to cope after seeing him drowned. I don't think so, though. I think something's really wrong about that place, and that it took its time before claiming my grandpa. You're free to have your own opinions, though. Where is everyone? I woke up one day and everyone, absolutely everyone, was or is gone. The internet is up, cable is running, electricity and water is still working, yet there's no one around, and I can't get into contact with anyone. No one answers when I call on the phone, and although I can see the messages I've uploaded to social media, I see nothing from anyone else, just old posts and comments from the day before this happened that don't change when I refresh. It's like time has been frozen, and all the animals, humans, and even bugs have been taken out of Earth. My name is... oh, who the hell cares? Who is gonna see this anyway? This is the only way to keep from going insane, uploading detailed accounts of whatever's happening to me, even though I have no idea if anyone can see it. If they can see it, then the responses are invisible to me because I've tried sending SOS messages to family, friends, and even strangers. Nothing big or unexpected happened before that day a few months ago. I'm a regular girl, working part-time in the city and sitting through college lectures when I'm not manning the counter of my local coffee shop. I live, or lived, with my parents and sister who's still in high school, since I couldn't afford to make it on my own yet. I had just come back from a late-night shift, working overtime from open to close since someone called out at the last minute, and I took an Uber back home. I used my spare key to get in the house, ate leftovers from dinner, took a hot shower, and climbed into bed. I had no dreams or weird visions or anything. I woke up to the sunlight coming through my window blinds. I looked at the time on my phone and realized I had overslept. When I went downstairs, I heard nothing but the TV playing an early morning show my mom loved to watch after dropping my sister off at school. Dad's absence could be explained by him going to work, but my mom's was weird. I looked around for her, but when I didn't find her, I didn't freak out. Not until I went outside, but I didn't do that until an hour had passed of me eating breakfast and thinking about the classes I'd missed the day before and that morning. I went out to catch a bus since it seemed Uber couldn't find a ride, and that's when I saw that my parents' cars were still in the driveway. Maybe my sister went to school on the bus for once, that was plausible, but what wasn't was my dad going to work without his car and my mom running an errand without hers. I remember looking into the windows of their vehicles, seeing nothing amiss, and trying their cell phones. It rang and ended with their voicemails. I don't think I realized how completely dead the neighborhood was until I walked to the nearest bus stop. The neighborhood was thoroughly dead. Children's bikes were abandoned on the sidewalk. Cars that would usually be gone during that time of day because the neighbors worked morning shifts like my dad were present in the garages. There was no sign of life anywhere. No birdsong, no butterflies or bees, despite the weather conditions being perfect for them. Everything was so quiet, like an empty graveyard. I felt like something was deeply, deeply wrong, but I tried not to think about it as I waited for the bus. The bus did not come after an hour, and traffic was strangely at a standstill. I began walking, traveling further into the city, and that's when I started to grow more concerned by the second. The city was just as dead as the neighborhood. The bus I had been waiting on was parked at a stop on a busy street, with no driver and no passengers. The wind blew grocery bags like they were tumbleweeds across the road, and the buildings, while all lit up from the inside, contained no people. No employees, no customers. You get the gist. At that point, I would have been overjoyed just to see a squirrel climb up a tree. I reacted just as anyone would. I panicked, and I mean panicked hard. I had an utter meltdown in the middle of Broad Street, hyperventilating and curling into a ball, soaked in my own sweat. There was no one around to help me, to call an ambulance, or even ask if I was all right. It was maddening, and it wasn't even midday yet. I walked all the way to my job, found the cafe open but vacant, and then walked to my college campus, which, of course, yielded the same results. I sat down in the lecture hall, frantically Googling anything on my phone that may relate to what was happening. All I could think was that the entire city had evacuated, and I was somehow left behind, or something like that. No news had been posted since yesterday on every website I checked. When I tried to refresh browser pages, the tabs would turn blank, and then an error message would appear. I went back home, which took at least 3 hours of walking, with sores developing on my feet, and got into my dad's car after finding his keys on the key tray in the hallway, a detail I hadn't noticed before. I was crying as I drove around the city, going around cars that were randomly stopped on the street. I drove past the city border, into the next town, which was exactly the same, so I drove to the next town after that one. During my impromptu road trip, I passed by unoccupied airports, the planes all there since clearly there were no flights taking off. The numbers I kept calling and texting were my family and friends and the police. I didn't know what else to do. Eventually I pulled over to the side of the road and sobbed and screamed in frustration, rocking in the driver's seat with my knees pulled up to my chest. I cried until I had no more tears left to shed, and my face was redder than a tomato with snot pouring out my nose like a faucet. This had to be a bad dream, I'd thought, or some kind of super elaborate hoax of which I was the sole victim. Day in and day out, I focused on adapting until I came across someone, and keeping myself sane by watching old YouTube videos and saved Instagram reels. I didn't dare go back home. The lack of the sound of my sister's rude jokes at my expense, my dad's laughter at some stupid sitcom, and my mother's cooking only served to give me a deep depression, during which I never left my room so I couldn't be reminded of how alone I was. Instead, I decided to try and make the most of this fucked up situation by traveling, since the world was still functioning, just without the people who made it that way. That's something I thought about a lot. As the weeks passed, I was so scared that the lights would shut off permanently and the water would stop running, so scared in fact that it made me want to vomit and pass out, but that never happened. Even reruns of TV shows still broadcasted when I turned on any TV. It was really fucking weird. I mean, really, really weird. Who was keeping the electrical paid? Who was tending to the plumbing? Who was broadcasting television and keeping Wi-Fi servers up? The only catch was that I couldn't see anything new that was uploaded past the day I realized I was alone, meaning no recent news, no live shows, nothing. I tried not to think about this too hard, because, to be honest, even though I was glad I could still flush toilets after I used them and turn on lights in dark rooms, the thought unsettled me. It made me feel like I was the center of the universe's cruelest practical joke. But I knew a prank of this magnitude was simply impossible, unless my brain was undergoing some high-tech simulator while my body was in the real world, making me think this was reality when it's actually a program designed as some mentally scarring experiment to see how a human would react when placed in this situation. At least, if that was the case, there was hope of me waking up and returning to normal society. But again, nothing happened the day before all this. I didn't consent to any experiment or scientific testing. And why would these hypothetical government agents or scientists choose me of all people? After the first 2 months, I began to enjoy myself. A bit, not too much, but a reasonable amount, I'd like to think. I know it probably sounds crazy from your end, but if I kept making theories and freaking out about seemingly being the only person on the planet, or at least on the continent, then I would go insane. The hecticness of daily life is something we can all relate to, feeling like a cog in the machine and wondering if life is just one trial of survival after another. You might have thought to yourself, am I just going to work non-stop until I die? Who am I? Why am I doing this? When can I just enjoy life and take it easy without worrying about the future or bills? Well, when I realized that the upside to humanity being erased, hopefully temporarily, was no rules and responsibilities, I looked at things with a fresher perspective. I would keep traveling until I found someone like me, of course, which was making me lose more hope each day, as I'd gone through a few states by this time. But I would at least take a moment to enjoy the peaceful solitude on the way. I've taken the best naps of my life in fields full of wildflowers, went skinny dipping in hot springs, and even went into a restaurant, thawed out the food from the walk-in fridge, and used their kitchen to cook myself gourmet meals to the best of my abilities. So many cars had keys in them, like they were all just sitting there for me to take a joyride in. I did donuts in parking lots. I went into Walmarts and stole video game consoles on which I played offline games on, and I slept in mansions in the best suites of any 5-star hotel. Every door was unlocked, making it unbelievably easy to go anywhere and do anything. One rich person's apartment I crashed in was in a high-rise, and I had an amazing time swimming in a pool on their balcony, which you could see the city miles down below through the glass floor. I always had to have noise playing wherever I went. I kept one earphone in and listened to music, and I always kept a TV on wherever I stayed. It replaced live human voices for me. It became white noise. I turned my tragedy into serenity, and though I still craved company, at least I could have a decent time until I found help, or woke up, or a scientist pulled the cords connecting my brain to the simulator or something. That feeling of freedom and carelessness didn't last long, though. The 3rd month came, and I was driving through the Midwestern region of the country in an RV I'd stolen so I could experience van life, like those influencers, but without the risk and the money. I was going to the East Coast because I wanted to stay in a beach house. My cousin liked renting them in Virginia, Florida, and the 2 Carolinas, and I'd always wanted to experience them. Of course, autumn had come and winter was starting, or should have been at least, but it was still warm enough for a dip in the sea. Global warming, I guess. Anyways, night came and I stopped in some random city, choosing an upscale hotel to stay in. Highest floor, biggest room, and a hoard of food from the kitchen, all to myself. I slept like a baby, listening to a podcast with the flat-screen TV playing some reality show. The lights always stayed on, and in this case it was 2 bright table lamps, one on each side of the king-sized bed, and a standing lamp in the corner. I woke up in the middle of the night to complete darkness and utter silence. The TV was off, so were all the lights. The curtain was drawn over the glass wall, which showed a beautiful view of the city. When I was sure I had left them open to look at the dazzling lights of the skyscrapers, instantly I sat up and started breathing heavily, knowing in my heart that my good time was over because the electricity was now gone. I figured I may as well just go back to sleep until daybreak, and then go and steal flashlights from the nearest store for the next night or something, but I wanted to open the curtains first. I guess I must have forgotten that I closed them. I pulled them aside, and my heart skipped a beat as I noticed something. The buildings in the city were still lit up. The energy still worked. I scrambled in the dark, pressing the power button on the bedside lamp. Nothing happened, so I felt for the cord, which had been unplugged. I plugged it back in and the lamp turned on, glowing a soft yellow. Upon a quick investigation, I realized all the lamps had been unplugged, and the remote to the TV was perched on the dresser across from my bed, even though I fell asleep with it on my nightstand. Then it hit me, all at once. It felt like the breath had been knocked from my lungs, and I immediately started to tremble. Someone had been in this room while I was asleep. And while that should have made me excited to discover another human, it terrified me instead, because whoever it was decided to fuck with me and leave me in complete darkness, rather than rejoice in the fact they had found another survivor. And if they would truly choose to scare me like this, even though I could very well be the only other human left on Earth, what type of person were they? Had they gone insane? Were they dangerous? Or was this simply proof that all of this was a hoax and they were now messing with me because I had started to make the best of my situation and that was too boring for the cameras? Honestly hoped to God the last part was the answer, because while that would be the meanest hoax ever conceived, at least the nightmare would be over. But not so. Deep down, I knew the prank theory was utterly stupid and wrong. I mean, even if it was possible, no prank would go on this long. I just wanted to believe that over my terrifying reality. After I turned the lights and TV back on, I noticed the door was open, showing the dark hallway. Now, I'm not the strongest or the bravest, but I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just go back to sleep. I gathered some stuff and used the light of my phone to navigate my way through the now dark hotel building, turning on the lights as I went. "Hello?" I called out. "Is anyone there?" When I got to the kitchen, I took a big carving knife with me, just in case. The dead silence unnerved me to absolutely no end. I searched every room, using keys from the office behind the lobby. It took a while, looking inside closets and bathrooms, but eventually I was able to confidently say that whoever unplugged the lamps in my suite was no longer in the building. I didn't know how to feel about any of it. Half of me wanted to be happy to the point of tears that someone was in this with me, but the other half just knew this wasn't good news at all. I trusted my gut and decided to leave. I got in the RV and drove until daybreak, putting as much distance between me and that place as possible. I became exhausted and parked in the most crowded parking lot I could find so I'd be hard to spot, then fell asleep. When I woke up in the middle of the afternoon, I started a regular day, trying to put the previous night past me. I toured this city I'd never been to before, and browsed a selection of name-brand clothes like Gucci and Prada that I would normally never be able to wear as a broke college student. I looked like a celebrity or some fashion model as I explored, looking for any sign of life. One of the things I missed the most was animals, like seeing someone walk their dog or watching a cat nap in a windowsill. When I returned to the RV at sundown, I was met with a disturbing sight. The door to the RV was wide open, and almost everything was out of place. The covers on the bed were strewn on the floor, alongside my clothes and the food and items I'd stolen from stores either for survival or pleasure. The cupboards were open, the faucets were left running, including the tub, and worst of all, someone doodled a smiley face in the dust of one of the RV windows. 2 long vertical lines for the eyes, and a curve under them for the mouth. This simple picture put so much fear in me, I felt like the world was collapsing. Once again, someone had intruded in on my space, and deliberately left a sign that they had been there. More than one person had to be fucking with me, because how did the person from the hotel know where I was? How would they have found me so quickly? There were a million places I could be at. There was just absolutely no way they knew I'd be in this one city in this one parking lot. If there was more than one person, then why were they doing this? What did they want? Why don't they just come up to me and talk like a normal human being so we can figure this shit out together? I think that's when paranoia first hit me. Sometimes I don't think I'm paranoid, and sometimes I do. I don't fucking know, okay? I feel like I'm going crazy. Well, that's when I first started having irrational thoughts like, who says it's a human to begin with? And If it is a human, who says they want to figure anything out? Maybe they know more than you do about why the world is like this, and they know it's unfixable, so they're deciding to have their sick fun with you because, let's face it, who's around to stop them? The human brain can be so intelligent but also so masochistic. Mine was torturing me with all these thoughts until I felt like I couldn't breathe. I decided to pack a bag of the stuff I've hoarded since day one and abandon the RV. I can't count how many times I looked over my shoulder as I left to find another car. I felt watched. Once again, I found a vehicle parked with the doors unlocked, small and black, which is definitely more inconspicuous than a hulking RV. The keys were, as usual, inside, and once I got to driving away from that city, it felt like I had a breath of fresh air. However, I wasn't going to keep that car for long because if whoever did that was around to see me get into it, I didn't want them to be able to recognize the car in whatever place I went next. This time, I stayed on the road all day, only stopping to relieve myself at a convenience store and get gas. I tried to appreciate the sights I drove past, but I couldn't stop thinking about the stranger, which is what I had decided to call him or her. It wasn't long then until I would reach the East Coast, but night came and I had to sleep. I didn't want to give up comfort just yet, but I was also extremely nervous that I had been followed, although I saw no other cars driving on the road. Instead of sleeping in upscale hotels, I decided to change things up a bit so I wouldn't be as predictable to the stranger. I considered sleeping in a crappy run-down motel, but I wanted to be absolutely sure they wouldn't know my next move, and I parked miles away from my destination, and using Google Maps, which thankfully was still functioning normally, I walked there, using back alleys. The sliver of rationality remaining in my brain told me that there's no way they were in that small town without me seeing them, following me in a vehicle, but I was taking no chances. I found a big grocery store, took the keys out of a random car in the parking lot that I was going to use the next morning, and decided to gather some covers from the domestics section and crash in one of the back offices of some manager. I locked the door, made a pad on the floor, and turned out the light. I ate a dinner of chips and candy, rather than microwaving or cooking something that would release a smell which would indicate my location. It was hard getting to sleep, but I managed, trying to quietly listen to ambient soundtracks on YouTube with a Bluetooth earphone stuffed in my ear. Sleep snuck on me really. I didn't even feel myself drifting off. I was bone tired, but confident that I left no tracks and was going to be safe. I woke up to music, but nothing was playing on my phone. In fact, my phone had died and the screen was black. No, the music was coming from the overhead speakers. An old tune from the 40s or 50s, one I faintly recognized but wasn't exactly too familiar with. We'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when. Someone was playing this over the intercom, and it blared throughout the entire store at an almost deafening volume. I sat there on the floor swaddled in covers, shaking so hard I could barely grip my phone, as I wondered if it was even safe to leave that cramped little office. That's when I figured I should have tried to find a security room to crash in, as I'd seen cameras installed on the way in earlier. Maybe I could have spotted whoever this was on the footage, but now it was too late. I made double sure the door was locked and then plugged my phone up to the outlet in the corner so I could at least see the time. I tried to remain as quiet as possible in case the stranger was still there. When I powered my phone on, I realized it was 4 a.m. and I decided I would not try to leave until sunrise, which should have been in a couple of hours. I just had to sit and wait until then. After the song ended, I heard something else play over the intercom. Someone was simply breathing into the microphone, soft and subtle, but definitely there. The stranger was still there, and I had no idea how they could have possibly found me. I even checked my phone to make sure my location wasn't turned on anywhere, and went through all my stuff thoroughly to be sure there wasn't some kind of AirTag or tracker attached to my clothes or something. My search came up empty. I stayed in that back office for most of the day, rather than leaving at sunrise like a sitting duck. I was too scared to leave. Hours passed of hearing nothing, no music and no breathing, but still, I didn't dare move an inch from where I sat on the floor. I was hungry and thirsty, I felt like a child hiding under the covers from a monster in their closet. I felt foolish. Finally, I checked my phone and saw that it was evening time. I looked for anything I could use as a weapon first, and all I found was a pen with a particularly sharp tip. I crept out the door and realized that once again the lights had been turned out on me. Why? Was whoever was stalking me trying to make it easier to get the jump on me? I removed my shoes so that my footsteps were quiet, my socks padding on the linoleum floor. The only illumination I had was the street lamps outside, streaming white, almost ghostly-looking light through the big front windows of the store, and the fridges, of course. When I got closer to the front of the store, where the registers were, I heard something fall off a shelf a few aisles away, not very far at all from my position. I immediately crouched down and listened intently, holding my backpack so the items contained within wouldn't make a rustling noise from me jostling it around. I heard no other sounds, but I was sure the stranger was still here. There was no way whatever that was had fallen on its own. Tears of fear slipped down my cheeks as I decided to abandon my backpack, deciding the contents of it were not worth the risk of it making a noise or slowing me down if I had a confrontation. I left it there on the floor as I changed directions, moving towards the back of the store to see if there was an emergency exit or back door I could exit from instead. I should have done that to begin with, but I don't tend to think too rationally when I'm scared at times. Indeed, all the way at the back, there were a set of double doors I could just barely make out. They were the kind that had this big silver bar in the middle you had to push to open them. And those always made a noise. I braced myself, and in one swift motion opened the doors and slipped outside. Oh my God, it was absolutely freezing cold outside. I did feel the back office get colder throughout the day, but I thought it was because of the AC or something. No, it's because it was snowing. Blankets of snow powdered the air, and the ground was quickly being painted all white. The air felt like I had stepped into a freezer. It had just felt like summer yesterday, and at this time of day the sun was supposed to start setting, but twilight had already fully descended upon the world. The sky was black, not a star could be seen, and the moon was a tiny sliver barely visible. It was barely autumn, let alone early winter. While it certainly gave me a shock, I did not waste a moment thinking about the drastic change in weather. Instead, I made my way around the front and ran to the car I'd prepared to leave in. As soon as I opened the door, all the lights in the store came on, and it glowed yellow like a beacon in the dark. I froze and stared at the windows, my eyes scanning for any movement. I thought for just a moment that I saw a dark figure slip out of sight behind a shelf, but it was so subtle that it could have been a trick of my imagination. I got inside the car, shut and locked the door, ignited the engine, and drove out of that parking lot like a bat out of hell. Once again, I cried. All I could think was, why? Why me? Why am I forced to endure this psychological torture? The only other person left here is stalking me, and I think they mean harm to me. Where is everyone? Where did you all go? Why did you leave me here by myself with some fucking lunatic? Why won't any of you answer my message? Oh, but don't think that's the worst part. The worst part is, it only took 15 minutes for me to run out of gas, even though when I checked the car out the day before, the tank said it was full. When I pulled over at a 7/11 to get gas, I noticed the tank was already open, as if someone had messed with it, and a tube that may have once been connected to something was sticking out still, dripping with a dark liquid I hadn't noticed before, so desperate to get away, but someone had siphoned the fucking gas. And there's another fucking smiley face in the back window. It was drawn with a black marker. I checked the trunk and back seat, worried someone had hitched a ride without me knowing. Someone knew I was planning on using this car, and they could have definitely hidden here without me noticing it until it was too late, but they didn't. However, they did leave something in one of the back seats, my backpack that I had left in the store. How did they sneak out of there so quickly to put it in the car, then go back inside to turn on all the lights? It made no sense. No sense whatsoever. There has to be more than one. There has to be more than one. I checked it. None of my things were inside. In fact, there were just pictures of me. Dozens of Polaroids showing me at various times over the past several weeks, stealing from stores, eating food, scouting out cars, and even sleeping. In fact, there was a photo of me sleeping in the back office of that store. How the fuck did they get in? And without me waking up? The door was still locked when I got up. That's impossible. This was too much. I felt the entire world spin around me, but I still got behind the wheel and decided to drive as fast and far as I could. I was dizzy, but I was also so afraid. I almost crashed a couple different times, but I didn't care. I was in pure survival mode. That was a couple days ago. I'm writing this on my phone. I've been sleeping in my car with a knife ever since, and I plan on locating a gun store when I get to the coast so I can arm myself better. Although I've no idea how to use a gun. I park my car deep in the woods at night, away from any buildings. Landmarks just make me easier to find. It's not long now until I get to the coast of North Carolina. I plan on getting on a boat and getting out of here. I'm not going to do anything crazy, like sail to another continent, but I'm going to skirt the coasts till I get more down south. I don't feel safe traveling on land anymore. I'm going to keep updating as I go. And this is the only thing that keeps me sane. I have hope that someone will reach out or something will happen. I just think, they found me. I was typing and I heard someone. I think it's a man. He was outside my car. I drove in a tree, and ran on foot. Help me, God. Help me. He was running after me. I'm hiding hard. If I don't update again tomorrow. You know the kind of town where everyone knows everyone, where the local diner serves coffee in mugs stamped with your name, and everyone will lend a hand to a neighbor in need? A place where generations of families grew up together? Well, that is the sort of place where I live. Sure, it is a bit rustic. Hell, I barely have reliable internet. But it is nice enough for us. It's the kind of place where time feels like it's standing still. Except for one thing, the nights. The nights here are a little different. I've lived here all my life and there's no place I'd rather be. Or at least that's what I used to think. This place has its quirks, like any small town, but there's a big one that stands out for us. You see, every night, without fail, at 11:38 p.m., the town shuts down. Locks down. I'm not talking about just closing up shops and less people being out and about. I'm talking about a real lockdown. Doors slam shut and are barred, windows rattle and lock, and everyone knows they have to be inside and stay inside, at least for what happens next. The next part is strange. No one ever sees anything moving out there directly, but we all just know. We just know that somehow, something outside is trying to get in. An eerie silence falls over the streets. It's like the whole town is holding its breath. Then, in 12 minutes exactly, it is just over. I've always wondered why it happens at exactly 11:38 p.m. People here don't talk about it much, but when they do, they whisper. They say it's just the way things are, that it's been happening for as long as anyone can remember. But I know better. I've seen it. Whatever it is, the first time I noticed it, I was still pretty young. I think I was 10 or 11. I'd stayed up late reading some of my favorite comic books. My parents warned me, like many other kids in town, that we had to go to bed early. But if we did get up, then absolutely no leaving the house or leaving any windows or doors open. I was not asleep, but was still following the rules. When I heard the strangest sound, it was a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. I looked out the window, and that's when I saw it. The streets were empty, but there was a presence. It's hard to describe. It wasn't a person or an animal. It was something else, something that didn't feel like it belonged. It moved with this strange, jerky motion, like it wasn't entirely in control of its own body. It radiated a disturbing sense of distortion that made my head hurt, and my eyes had a difficult time focusing on it. I could feel this overwhelming sense of hunger that made my skin crawl. Before I knew it, it was over. It had passed my house, and I realized I had been staring out my window in a hypnotic daze. It was almost midnight, and I went to sleep and did not tell my parents about the disturbing thing I had seen. I didn't see it again for years, but the feeling never left. Every night at 11:38 on the dot, when the town shuts down, I know it is there. We all try to act like it's not, just behave like we have a strict curfew and that nothing is really out there. Yet the people who are too bold or foolish and think that it's nothing, well, they don't last long. Those of us who are still here know that whatever that thing is, it's out there. Stalking, hunting, looking for anything, an open window, a cracked door. Disappearances are frequent, especially for such a small town. The police have a whole song and dance for anyone who goes missing from the outside, but when it is a resident, well, it is more of a case where the families of the victims are reprimanded for not having known better. No one knows why the window of time is so mercifully brief. Almost just as suddenly as it starts, it's over. By 11:50 p.m., the streets are quiet again and the town feels normal. But it's not normal. It never was. People here have learned to live with it. They lock their doors, shut their windows, and pretend it's not happening. I asked my parents why we don't just move, and they never gave me a good answer. All they said was, "It wouldn't do any good. We have to endure. It has to be here. It is safer for everyone if it's here." It did not make sense. I know people can get attached to places, but it felt crazy to me. I couldn't just pretend this was normal. Not after what I saw. Not after what I felt. There was something out there, and it was worse than anyone would believe. It was just recently that I saw it again. It was a normal night, at least as normal as nights could be in my town. I was getting ready to go to bed when I noticed that my cat Quincy was missing. I looked everywhere, but I couldn't find him. Then I heard something and looked through the window to spot a familiar shape, and my heart sank. He was outside. He must have gotten out when I had come home earlier and was sauntering along the sidewalk, clueless to the impending danger. The time was 11:36 p.m. I had no idea if the creature did anything to animals, but I did not want to find out. I had never let Quincy outside before, and he did not come back to my shouted calls for his return. I had to do something dangerous and stupid to save him. I rushed outside, sprinting toward him and trying to grab him and bring him in before it was too late. I managed to reach him and pick him up, but then I froze when I sensed a presence as I was scrambling back to my door. Quincy's ears folded back and he hissed. I felt paralyzed, and then I thought I saw it again. It was different this time, larger and more overwhelming than before. Its presence seemed to fill the entire street, pressing against the houses like an unseen force. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, my breath caught in my throat. To my horror, it seemed to finally regard me. Quincy jumped out of my hands and ran back to my house. He had fortunately evaded whatever interest the thing might have had with him. The creature's head twisted unnaturally in my direction, its distorted features coalescing into more recognizable shapes. Staring into the grotesque visage forced a scream out of me as I beheld the blasphemous impossibility. I turned and sprinted away, screaming like a maniac, my heart hammering against my ribcage with such force that each beat felt like it might crack my chest open. The sound of its pursuit echoed behind me, a wet, slapping noise like a monstrous jellyfish gliding across the ground. Its deafening roar filled the air, shaking the ground beneath my feet as I ran for my life. I did not know if I could get away. No one I knew had been outside and survived. I ducked into an alley, my hands shaking as I pressed myself against the wall. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, and I could feel sweat dripping down my face. I didn't dare look around the corner. I didn't dare move. And then I heard the harrowing screams. They sliced through the air, piercing and full of terror. My heart raced as I strained to see who was making them, but all I could make out were shadowy figures caught in the open. The screams were short, sharp, and then they were swallowed by the night. The deafening silence that followed only added to the fear weighing down on me. I stayed pressed against the wall, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. The darkness seemed to come alive with every creak and rustle, amplifying my fear. I held my breath until I heard the sound of the creature moving away, and then, Just like that, it was gone. But the eerie stillness lingered, haunting me even after the clock struck 11:50 p.m. The streets were once again quiet, but my nerves were still on edge. I stumbled back to my house, every step feeling like a race against time. Quincy waited anxiously at the door and bolted inside with me, seeking shelter inside. The horrible night had left me shaken, but grateful to be alive. Whatever that thing is, it does not belong in this world. It is not of this time or place, and its presence is so unsettling, it makes your mind ache just to catch a glimpse of it. No one can tell of its origins. Maybe they are lost in the depths of history. But whatever its history, it remains. Always there, lurking in the shadows every night without fail. At that point, I did the one thing you probably think everyone should have done by now. I left my hometown. I moved to the largest city I could reach to get away from it all. My parents did not approve. In fact, they tried to tell me I could not go. I was so desperate to get out of there that I had to sneak away in the early morning when they could not interfere. I never understood why we all stayed there and tried to ignore the eldritch nightmare that hunted us at night. It seemed so simple, and I felt better at first. The city felt alive with the hum of traffic and the distant chatter of people during the day, a cacophony that made me feel safe, anonymous. Indeed, I thought I'd left the nightmare behind, that the creature was just a memory, a relic of a past I could bury. My new apartment is a cozy studio on the 5th floor, with a view of the bustling streets below. High enough where looking out the window does not fill me with dread at night. Unfortunately, something happened last night that has shattered the fragile illusion of my peaceful transition. On the first night in my new place, I sat on the edge of my bed, flipping through a magazine to distract myself from the creeping unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. The clock on the nightstand read 11:28 p.m. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the creature was gone, that I was safe now. But the weight of the past lingered, a shadow in the corner of my mind that I couldn't shake. By 11:38 p.m., the city outside my window was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of traffic and distant music had faded, replaced by an unsettling stillness. I tried to focus on the magazine, but my eyes kept drifting toward the window, the darkness beyond the glass pressing in on me. I tried to focus on the magazine, but my eyes kept drifting toward the window, the darkness beyond the glass pressing in on me. And then I heard it. A soft, tentative tap against the pane. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, the magazine slipping from my fingers and falling to the floor. The sound was light, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill coursing through my veins. I told myself it was nothing, I was just being paranoid. But then it came again, another tap, this time more insistent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My eyes were fixed on the window, the darkness beyond it seeming to pulse with a life of its own. The tapping stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then a faint scratching sound, like claws on glass. My heart sank. I knew that sound. I knew what it meant. Slowly, with my legs trembling beneath me, I rose from the bed and approached the window. My hand reached for the curtain, hesitated, and then, with a deep, shaky breath, I pulled it back. What I saw made me freeze in terror. The creature was perched on the fire escape outside my window, its twisted form silhouetted against the moonlit sky. Grandma died with dignity at the age of 94 the other day, surrounded by her loved ones, so I don't get why she's come back. She was waiting for me when I returned from the hospice. Outside, by the door, I barged by her, or through her. I was so discombobulated that I don't know which, and went in. She didn't follow me, just stood by the door. I think she can't come in. I'm certainly not about to ask her. I don't understand why she's doing this to me. She lived a full, respectable life, and she was a catalog of aches and pains that I can't begin to list. She chose to die freely and openly, after lots of discussion. Well, some discussion. I told her about the option, you see. The medical staff in our region aren't allowed to raise it with patients after some scandal about homeless or disabled or mentally ill people being pressured into it. I forget which. Some local busybodies took to the press and made a huge fuss, and the sanctimonious old geriatrics who run this place quickly put a fuck ton of extra rules in place. But there's nothing to say that a loving grandson can't gently talk about the option to his suffering grandma, especially since grandma has a nice house and I was forced to live with my parents. It's the economy, stupid, until grandma moved to the hospice and someone, I forget who it was, suggested I might as well move into her house since it was lying empty, and she has all these plants and it can be sorted out later. Oh yes, it will be sorted out. It's later now. And I put the plants out by the pavement the second day. I don't have time to waste on plants, they were dying anyway. Grandma looked at me as I told her, her eyes bright and unclouded. She was wearing a very pretty lacy blue nightgown. It looked expensive. "Thank you, Nicholas," she said deliberately. Mom told me about her decision later that day, struggling to hold back tears. She wants us all there, Nicholas, singing her favorite song, Old Lang Syne. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes at the attention-seeking old bag. Everything went well. Grandma closed her bright eyes. I was out of there. My parents agreed I could stay in her house until we sort things out. Honestly, I don't think they enjoyed having me with them either. She was there when I returned home. I genuinely thought it was just a random old lady in a blue dress standing by the door. Then I went up, she turned to me, and I froze. She opened her mouth and I saw very clearly the gaping black hole. I heard her voice, very deliberate and slow. "My plants, Nicholas." The hole grew wider and wider and moved closer to me, starting to swallow me up. I unfroze and barged in. She's still there, standing. I know I can move past her if I move very fast, and I know she's not going anywhere, and neither am I. It is so cliché to say, you won't find my town on any map, but it is true. My town is one of those middle-of-nowhere places. We are not directly off an exit or main highway. Reaching our city limits requires several obscure turns on unpaved roads. You won't find any signs directing you our way either. Besides delivery or service people, there isn't much outside traffic. The dense thicket of trees surrounding my town makes for even more isolation. My community lives differently from most. No, we are not Amish. However, we maintain a simple way of living. The founding fathers of my town roamed the earth hundreds of years ago. As technology grew and developed, many wanted to evolve with the times. However, our wisest forefather, Alexander Stone, knew these new ways would lead to corruption and the downfall of man. So he took charge and excommunicated those who sought to lead the community to hell and renamed the town from its previous Granville to Stoneville. His descendants continue to uphold those values and ways of living even now, in the year of our Lord, 2029. A little over a decade before I was born, it was decided to take a few small steps into the modern era. In addition to the most basic creature comforts, our town elders have remained steadfast in their mission to honor and uphold tradition. There are many spoken and unspoken rules of Stoneville. But the most critical rule is that absolutely no one is to enter the woods. The only exception to this rule is the annual trip our elders make with our yearly offering. We hold a fear-based respect for the ancient grove. Every winter solstice we have what is called the Festival of the Forest. It is a time of drinking, feasting, and dancing. A maiden of the wood is crowned during the ceremony. In the maiden of the wood is crowned during the ceremony. She must be a young, pure woman who has come of age, meaning turned 18 within the same year. While being crowned Maiden of the Wood sounds lighthearted and joyous, it is anything but. Once the maiden is selected, it essentially becomes a farewell party. After saying their goodbyes to family and friends, the town elders escort the Maiden of the Wood into the forest, along with baskets full of crops and handmade items. The group disappears into the void. The elders always return at daybreak the next morning. Just the elders. No crafts, no crops, no maiden. Every year on the Sabbath before the festival, we are told the history of how, since the founding of Stoneville, the elders have been making sacrifices to the forest god to protect our town and bring abundance to the community. Drymas, the forest god, came to Alexander Stone in a vision. He showed him the demons that lurk in the woods that surround our home and told him of how they hungered for human flesh. He vowed to protect our people in exchange for the yearly offering of the soul of an innocent on the cusp of womanhood. Her pure blood would ward away these abominations and replenish the soil, guaranteeing a fruitful harvest the next year. He wanted the people to celebrate the occasion with food, drink, and merriment. Thus, the Festival of the Forest began. Growing up as a young woman in Stoneville, we are constantly told what an honor it is to be chosen as maiden. You are becoming a part of something much greater than yourself, they say. Your family will be blessed beyond measure in the next year, they tell you. I have spent my whole life believing this to be true and silently judging the tears of sorrow from the chosen ones and their families. Even last year, when my sister's best friend and our neighbor was crowned Maiden of the Wood, I couldn't believe that her family seemed so broken by the decision. You would think such a devout family would be rejoicing at the favor shown upon them. I couldn't understand their reaction. Until now, my sister Grace was chosen. It's been 1 week and I still haven't fully processed it, but that's mostly because, well, she's back. At daybreak, the elders didn't return like they usually do. It was only my sister, completely unclothed, covered in dirt, mud, and what looked like blood. She stumbled through the mist toward the waiting crowd. Gasps of terror spread like a rogue wave. Papa quickly stepped forward, removing his jacket to cover her exposed body. He swiftly ushered Grace, Mother, and myself through the silently parting crowd and toward our home. She hasn't spoken a word since returning. She doesn't eat. She doesn't sleep. I haven't even seen her use the facilities. Mother bathed her when we returned home, but you can still smell her. It's a stench that I can only describe as rot. A putrid sweet musk that seems to permeate our entire home. Grace just sits and stares. That is until Papa prays over dinner, or Mother sings her hymns. She gets squirmy then, like little bugs are crawling on her skin. She covers her ears and rocks back and forth. Wednesday night she started hissing as Papa blessed the food, and yesterday she struck Mother as she sang while tidying up. The long, clawed nails Grace has grown since returning left marks on Mother's face and drew blood. My parents ignore all these developments, but I see their concern and fear growing just like the crowd that stands outside our house every night with their torches and rifles. They want answers that we can't provide, and I can tell from the vicious chanting and sounds of the ramming of our front door that they will not wait any longer. I fear for what is about to come. However, my fear isn't for them breaking in. It's for what they're breaking out. A stranger approached my car at night with a warning, check the back seat. I like to think that I take my personal safety very seriously. I don't stand too close to the road while waiting for the walk signal. I have my location shared with my sister and mom. I keep my wits about me when I'm out in public, and I try not to dawdle after getting into my car. If I had only been more diligent about that last rule, I might not be in the situation I'm in now. Early this morning, just after midnight, I was sitting in my parked car outside of my favorite grocery store. I was exhausted from picking up a friend's evening shift, and so I stopped to grab dinner on my way home from work. The store's in an isolated part of town, but I had never felt unsafe in the area. Then again, I'd never been so late at night. The second I exited the store with my purchase, the old cashier closed up shop for the night and turned off all the lights in the building. For some reason, I did something I never do. I started eating in my car. As a precaution, I try not to linger in isolated parking lots, especially as a young woman who often has to run errands after dark. Maybe it was the hunger, or maybe the fact that, due to a recent breakup, my house hasn't felt all that welcoming in the past few weeks. In any case, I was in no rush to return home. I pulled up an episode of The Terror on my phone and settled in to eat. I enjoyed a few minutes of blissful peace and quiet before a shout pierced through the night. I looked up from my phone and was surprised to find a woman standing in front of my car, waving her arms at me. My car was parked right in front of the store, facing towards the building, and there was only a thin sidewalk separating my vehicle from the store's exterior. I hadn't seen her coming at all. It was like she had emerged from the brick wall before me. She rounded my car, coming to a stop beside the driver's side window. She then started pointing at the ground, the universal signal for roll your window down. Fat chance, I thought. Though she looked sane and kempt, I had no clue what her intentions were. In fact, I felt pretty vindicated in always locking my car doors immediately after entering. The woman, perhaps seeing I was making no move to exit my vehicle, then told me something no one wants to hear. "Hey!" she shouted. "There's someone in your back seat." My mouth went dry. Time seemed to slow as 1,000 horror movie scenes raced through my head. I could almost feel the piano wire digging into my neck, the barrel pressing into my temple. I undid my seatbelt and prepared to launch myself out of the car. Now that the intruder knew I was aware of their presence, would I even have enough time to run? With one hand on the door handle, I stole a glance into the rearview mirror and saw no one. My car is a compact hatchback, meaning there is very little room for a person to hide in my cabin. Even in my exhausted state, I would have noticed someone upon looking into the mirror. My terror fading to confusion, I turned around in my seat, surveying the cabin with my own eyes, and confirmed that there was no one in my back seat. Click. When I turned back around, the woman had taken another step closer to my car. Her body was barely a foot from my door, and her fingers were wrapped around the handle. There were a few more deep clicks as she tried, unsuccessfully, to open the locked door. I raised my gaze, and she gave me an odd smile, as though she and I were sharing a private joke. For the first time, using the faint glow of the street lamp, I took a closer look at the woman's face. Her skin was stretched tightly across her skull, making her thin mouth and nostrils appear as though they'd been cut onto her. Her eyes were deep-set and ovate, and her teeth seemed both too small and too numerous. I allowed myself a brief moment to gawk at the face before me, and then I threw my car into reverse and hightailed it out of the lot. For a few disheartening seconds, the woman held onto the door, keeping in step with my vehicle as I backed up. Luckily, she soon let go and I drove away, my mind racing with the realization that the woman was trying to bait me out of my car. Even more disturbing was the fact that it had almost worked. I wondered if she had others with her that I simply hadn't seen, and what she had wanted from me. I hoped I had narrowly escaped a robbery, as opposed to something much more sinister. I got back to my house 20 minutes later, still shaken from my encounter. I rushed inside the house and made sure that all of my doors and windows were locked. My exhaustion did little to soothe my nerves. My mind played tricks on me as I got ready for bed, conjuring up flashes of the woman's face in the dark corners of my house. I had a long, vivid nightmare, most of which I've either forgotten or is irrelevant to this account. All I know is that when I jolted awake some hours later, it was to the sound of a frantic banging on my front door. I sat up in bed, unsure if I was still dreaming or not. My alarm clock read 4:17. It was far too early for someone to be knocking on my door unless there was some kind of emergency, which, given the forcefulness of the knocks, there may have been. Slowly I rose from my bed and inched towards the entryway. I had never before been in such a situation and was at somewhat of a loss as to how to react. I didn't smell a fire, thankfully, but that didn't mean all was well. Suddenly, I heard a man's voice calling out my name in a questioning tone. It sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't immediately place it. "Who is it?" I called back. "Brian," answered the disembodied voice, and relief washed over me. My neighbor Brian lived in the house across the street. We weren't close exactly, but I often saw him walking down the block with his dog Bailey. I turned on the entryway light, but as I was still in my sleepwear, I didn't want to open the door unless I had to. Instead, I called back to him. "What's the matter?" "Well," he began. I heard his voice crack and he cleared his throat. "Do you have someone over right now?" "What?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. "No, I don't. Why do you ask?" "The dog had to go out, and while I was in the yard with him, I thought I saw someone in your front window. Someone who didn't look
Quite right.
I stilled, feeling as though I were in some terrible dream. Turning around and glancing down the dark hallway, I wished I had turned on more lights on my way to answer the door. She followed you home, I thought. She's in your house with you right now. I was ready to bolt out the door into the cold, but by some miracle, I had just enough presence of mind left to consider my neighbor's words more carefully. Something was wrong. I stepped away from the door. "Are you all right, Brian?" He cleared his throat again, and when he next spoke, his voice sounded slightly different from before, as though he were testing out a new timbre. "Of course, I just got a bit of a cold here, but I still wanted to check in on you." My voice wavered as I voiced a question to my neighbor. "But your dog, isn't it a girl?" Brian didn't respond. My mind reeled in the torturous silence, trying to discern whether the threat was outside the door or inside the house with me. After a full minute of complete stillness, the handle to my front door began to move. It rotated downwards as far as it could before the lock stopped it, then shook as the person on the other side of my door pulled on the handle. This happened several more times as the person tested my lock, and then there was a powerful bang as though someone had rammed into my door with all their might. After that, there was silence again. I stood frozen in place for another minute. I had no peephole, but I worked up the nerve to walk into the living room and peer through the blinds into my front yard. In the distance, walking down the street away from my house, was a figure. Although I couldn't see the face, something deep within me knew it was the same person who had tried to open my car door. I watched her walk away into the quiet night until she disappeared from my view. Needless to say, I didn't get much sleep for the rest of the night. I split my time between roaming the perimeter of my house, looking for anything suspicious, and sitting in my kitchen running the events of the night over in my mind. The most likely explanation was that I'd been dreaming. After all, I'd nearly been baited into opening my door to a potential criminal just hours before, so it made sense that I'd have a nightmare about a similar situation. Then again, I had never in my entire life had a dream so vivid. Maybe, somehow the woman really did follow me home. She easily could have stuck a tracker on my car, but how in the world did she know Brian's name, and how had she impersonated him so well? The sun is setting now. I haven't left the house all day. I've been too haunted by the idea of someone trying to draw me out into the open. No matter how many times I check the house, I still feel as though I catch glimpses of the woman in my periphery, of her beady eyes and uncanny smile. I suppose I should try to get some sleep now, impossible as that seems at this point. I just needed to jot this down before I went to bed, in case A, anything happens to me, and B, you ever think about blindly trusting the warnings of a stranger?